If you think you understand power, you've never watched a man like Lucian Vale walk into a room he already owns. Before you scroll past this, stick around because what happens when this brutal duke meets the one woman who refuses to bow will shatter everything you think you know about obsession and survival. Drop a like if you're ready for a story that doesn't play safe, and comment what city you're watching from because this tale crosses every border. November wind cut through the northern territories like a blade through silk, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and older blood. Duke Lucian Vale rode at the front of his regiment, spine straight despite 3 days without proper sleep, his leather gloves stiff with dried crimson that no amount of rain had washed clean. The men behind him maintained formation, not from discipline alone, but from the understanding that their commander viewed weakness the way wolves viewed lambs. 23 dead, 14 captured. The border skirmish had resolved itself the way Lucian Vale resolved all conflicts, with overwhelming force and zero negotiation. Mercenaries funded by rival territories learned too late that Ravenshallow's duke didn't issue warnings before he struck. He simply struck, then left the ruins as lessons for whoever came next. The keep materialized through the gray afternoon mist like a promise carved from stone and iron. Ravenshollow had stood for 4 centuries, its black walls absorbing countless sieges, and every duke before Lucian had added their brutality to its foundations. But none had wielded power quite like the current occupant. None had understood that true control meant making your enemies destroy themselves while you watched from comfortable distance. Guards snapped to attention as the regiment passed through the outer gates. Stable hands rushed forward to collect horses. Servants appeared with practiced efficiency, eyes downcast, movements economical. Everyone at Ravenshollow understood the first rule of survival: be useful, be invisible, be silent unless directly addressed. Lucy dismounted in the main courtyard without acknowledging the dozens of people orchestrating his return. His second-in-command, Captain Thorne, fell into step beside him with a report already prepared. Supply chain secured, my lord. The mercenary captain gave up his employer before the end. Expected. Lucian stripped off his gloves as they crossed into the keep's entrance hall. Wren lacks imagination. He'll try bribery next, then legal maneuvering through his pet ministers. Document everything. Already arranged. They climbed the wide marble staircase where portraits of previous dukes glared down with painted disapproval. Lucian had never bothered replacing them. Dead men made excellent reminders that power was temporary unless you made it permanent through force of will. His private chambers occupied the eastern tower, strategic, defensible, and isolated enough that conversations stayed private. Lucien allowed himself precisely 15 minutes to wash the border campaign from his skin before duty resumed. Hot water turned rust-colored in the basin. He studied his reflection briefly in the polished metal mirror. 34 years old, face harder than it had been at 20. Eyes that had witnessed enough violence to fill graveyards, but showed no particular emotion about it. Some men became monsters gradually. Lucien had simply recognized what he was and built an empire around that truth. The council meeting convened at sunset in the great hall, where chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire. 23 nobles occupied the semicircle of high-backed chairs, each representing territories absorbed into Ravenshallow's growing dominion. They rose when Lucian entered, not from respect, but from the understanding that remaining seated suggested confidence they didn't actually possess. Gentlemen, Lucian took his seat at the head of the table without ceremony. Reports. Trade Minister Caldwell went first, detailing merchant routes and tariff adjustments with the nervous precision of a man who understood that incorrect figures had consequences. Agricultural yields followed, then military expenditures, then the endless bureaucratic machinery that transformed violence into governance. Lucian listened with absolute focus. People mistook his brutality for mindlessness, but the Duke of Ravenshollow had built his power through meticulous attention to detail. Every trade agreement contained leverage. Every diplomatic overture concealed pressure points. He ruled the same way apex predators hunted, by understanding the terrain better than anyone else. And the border situation? Lord Ashford ventured carefully. Resolved. Lucien's tone suggested the topic was closed. Permanently. No one asked for elaboration. The meeting continued for another hour before Lucien dismissed them with a gesture. The nobles filed out with obvious relief, leaving only his inner circle, Captain Thorne, Minister Caldwell, and Cassian Moorholt, his oldest advisor and the closest thing Lucian had to a friend. Cassian waited until the doors closed before speaking. Lord Wren sent another letter, requesting audience. Burn it. He's gathering support among the smaller houses, promising them protection from Ravenshallow's expansion. Lucian leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Let him. Desperate men make mistakes. We'll document every conversation, every bribe, every treasonous whisper. When the crown finally moves against him, we'll have enough evidence to bury 3 generations of his family. And if he moves against us first, then he dies. Simple. Final. The way Lucien preferred all problems to resolve themselves. Cassian had served Lucien for 15 years and understood the Duke's mind better than most. There's one more matter. Lady Seraphina Arden arrived this afternoon. She's requesting private audience. The name sparked recognition. Arden, the disgraced house whose patriarch had backed the wrong faction during the last succession crisis. Land seized, titles revoked, families scattered to the political winds, standard consequences for choosing poorly. Why? She didn't specify, but she's been waiting 4 hours and refuses to leave until you receive her. Lucian almost smiled. Persistence suggested either stupidity or desperation, neither of which impressed him. Tomorrow, noon, 10 minutes, no more. But curiosity was a dangerous thing, even for men who believed themselves beyond such vulnerabilities. Lucien found himself wondering what kind of woman demanded audience with the Duke who had destroyed her family's legacy. He would discover the answer soon enough. The next morning arrived wrapped in fresh snowfall that transformed Ravenshollow into something almost beautiful. Lucian spent the early hours reviewing intelligence reports from agents embedded in rival territories. Information was currency in the aristocracy, and he traded it ruthlessly, feeding carefully crafted lies to some enemies while exposing others to their allies, watching the resulting chaos from strategic distance. At noon precisely, Lady Seraphina Arden entered his private study. Lucian looked up from his paperwork and felt something shift in the carefully controlled architecture of his thoughts. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. No delicate features or practiced fragility. Seraphina Arden stood 5'7" with the posture of someone who had survived falling from grace and decided to remain standing anyway. Dark auburn hair pulled back severely, gray eyes that met his directly without the usual fear or calculation, silver dress that suggested mourning rather than seduction. Most women who entered this room wanted something: protection, advancement, revenge against rivals. Their desperation perfumed the air like cheap flowers. Seraphina carried no such scent. Lady Arden, Lucian gestured to the chair across from his desk. You have 10 minutes. She sat without rushing, arranged her skirts with economical grace, then spoke with a voice that carried no pleading. My family's estates in the Southern Valley. I want them returned. Direct. Stupid, but direct. Your father committed treason. My father made a political miscalculation. There's a difference. Not legally. Then I'm appealing to something beyond law. Lucian set down his pen with deliberate slowness. You're asking me for mercy. No. Seraphina's gaze never wavered. I'm asking you to recognize that holding ruins benefits no one. The lands produce nothing under Crown management. Return them to someone with motivation to restore productivity. Them. And what makes you believe I care about productivity over precedent? Because despite what people say about you, Duke Vale, you're not actually a monster. You're a strategist who uses fear as efficiently as other men use gold. Pointless cruelty serves no purpose in your calculations. The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Thorne, standing guard by the door, went very still. No one, absolutely no one, analyzed Lucien Vale to his face and expected to walk away unscathed. But Lucien found himself leaning forward slightly, attention sharpening in a way it hadn't in years. This woman had either massive courage or suicidal honesty, perhaps both. You think you understand me? I think I understand incentive structures. Seraphina's hands remained folded calmly in her lap. You rule through calculated intimidation, but the southern estates represent minimal strategic value. Returning them costs you nothing except symbolic authority you don't actually need. And what do I gain? A functioning territory instead of expensive ruins, and proof that the Duke of Ravenshollow can be reasonable when approached correctly. Lucien studied her with the focus he usually reserved for military campaigns. Most people revealed themselves immediately under scrutiny: fear, ambition, deception. Serafina revealed nothing except stubborn intelligence and the kind of pride that survived humiliation intact. "Your 10 minutes are finished." She rose without protest. "Then I'll return tomorrow." "I didn't grant you another audience." "You didn't forbid one either." The audacity stunned even Thorne into a visible reaction. Women didn't challenge Lucien Vale. They obeyed, fled, or occasionally attempted seduction with predictable failure. They didn't announce plans to ignore his dismissal. Serafina moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Duke Vale. Everyone believes you're incapable of anything except cruelty. That's useful for you politically, but it also means they'll never see you coming when you choose alternative strategies." She left before he could respond. Thorne waited 30 seconds before speaking. "Should I have her removed from the grounds?" Lucien stared at the closed door, processing something he couldn't quite identify. Not attraction. He'd experienced that before and found it tedious. This was different, a challenge dressed in silver velvet, a problem that refused to solve itself through standard applications of pressure. "No." He returned to his paperwork. "Let her come back tomorrow." "My lord?" "She's either brilliant or insane. Either way, I want to understand which before I decide what to do with her." Serafina did return the next day, and the day after that, each time with new arguments, fresh analysis, careful reasoning that treated the Duke of Ravenshollow like a negotiating partner instead of a tyrant. Each time leaving before he explicitly dismissed her, maintaining the illusion of choosing departure rather than accepting rejection. By the fourth visit, Lucien admitted privately that he looked forward to these encounters. Not because she would succeed, the Arden estates would never be returned. Symbolic authority mattered more than she understood, but because Serafina treated him like a human being capable of reason rather than a force of nature requiring appeasement. It was novel, dangerous, and increasingly fascinating. On the 7th day, he made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. "The estates remain crown property," Lucien stated flatly during their afternoon meeting. "However, you will stay at Ravenshollow as a guest of the court." Serafina went very still. "I don't understand. You've argued that I'm a strategist rather than a monster. Prove it. Observe my court, attend council meetings, provide the intelligent analysis you claim to possess. If your insights prove valuable, I'll reconsider the estates." It was a trap, obviously. Once she accepted residence at Ravenshollow, she became another piece on his board to be moved at his convenience. Refusing would mean abandoning her family's last hope of restoration. Serafina understood immediately. He saw the recognition flash across her features, followed by calculation, then something that looked dangerously like determination. "How long?" "Until I'm satisfied you understand the machinery of power beyond theoretical analysis." "That could be months." "Or years." Lucien smiled without warmth. "Those are my terms." She stood, paced to the window overlooking the snow-covered courtyard, then turned back with her decision already made. "I accept, with one condition." The audacity continued to surprise him. "You're negotiating from no position whatsoever." "I'm establishing boundaries. I'll observe, analyze, provide counsel if requested, but I won't become another frightened servant or political decoration. My presence here remains professional." "You think you can dictate terms to me inside my own fortress? I think if you wanted a terrified prisoner, you wouldn't have made this offer." Lucien rose from his desk and crossed the room until less than 3 feet separated them. Most people retreated when he invaded their space. Serafina held her ground, chin lifted, meeting his gaze with that unbroken gray stare. "Lady Arden," he said softly, "everyone who enters Ravenshollow changes. The only question is whether they break or adapt. Then I'll adapt." No hesitation. "But I won't break." The challenge hung between them like drawn steel. "We'll see." Lucien stepped back. "Captain Thorne will arrange your quarters. Council meets tomorrow at dawn. Don't be late." That night, Lucien stood alone in his chambers watching snow fall across the northern mountains. The decision to keep Serafina at Ravenshollow made strategic sense. Her intelligence could prove useful, and controlling her meant controlling any remaining Arden loyalists. But strategy didn't explain the strange anticipation he felt knowing she would be present at tomorrow's council. It didn't explain why he'd replayed their conversations multiple times, analyzing her arguments with more attention than he'd given most military campaigns. Lucian had spent his life building armor against weakness, against sentiment, against anything that could be weaponized by enemies who understood that even monsters had vulnerabilities. Serafina Arden represented exactly the kind of liability he'd always avoided, which meant he needed to understand her, control her, and ultimately eliminate her as a potential threat to the empire he'd built through blood and calculation. Or so he told himself while snow continued falling and something dangerous continued growing in the disciplined architecture of his thoughts. The first council meeting Serafina attended became legendary within Raven's Hollow for reasons no one dared speak aloud. She entered the Great Hall wearing dark blue, took a seat in the observation section, and proceeded to demolish 3 ministers' reports through pointed questions delivered with devastating politeness. Minister Caldwell, your trade projections assume stable grain prices. Have you factored in the drought affecting our southern territories? Caldwell stammered. He had not. Lord Ashford, your military expenditure request includes payment for 400 soldiers. Your last roster listed 370. Where are the additional 30 men stationed? Ashford went pale. The additional payments were fictitious, a standard embezzlement scheme. By the meeting's end, 2 ministers had resigned in humiliation, and the remaining nobles regarded Serafina with the wide-eyed fear usually reserved for the Duke himself. Lucian said nothing during the meeting, but afterward, he found her in the castle library reviewing trade documents. You made enemies today. Serafina didn't look up from her reading. I identified incompetence. If they're enemies after that, they were always going to be enemies. Most women would approach court politics more carefully. Most women aren't trying to prove themselves to the Duke of Raven's Hollow. She finally met his gaze. You wanted intelligent analysis. I provided it. Lucian moved closer, studying her with predatory focus. You realize half the council now wants you removed from court. Then they'll have to convince you to send me away. Serafina returned to her documents. Can they? It was see. The question was a blade aimed directly at his ego. Could anyone convince the Duke of Ravenshollow to do anything he didn't already want to do? The answer was obvious, but the fact that she'd asked it, that she understood exactly how to redirect potential backlash, demonstrated intelligence that went beyond mere cleverness. No, Lucian admitted it quietly. They can't. Then I'll continue providing value until you decide I'm no longer useful. She turned a page. That's how transactions work. You think our arrangement is transactional. Isn't everything. Serafina looked up with those unsettling gray eyes. You give commands. People obey because the alternative is worse. I provide analysis. You consider returning my family's estates. Every relationship here runs on calculated exchange. And what do you think I'm calculating regarding you? Whether I'm more useful as an advisor or as an example. No fear in her voice. Pure pragmatism. I'm betting on advisor because you have plenty of examples already and they've started losing effectiveness. Lucian felt that dangerous stirring again. Not affection, never that simple. Something raw. Possession mixed with curiosity, mixed with the realization that Serafina Arden saw through his carefully constructed reputation to the machinery underneath. Most people feared the monster. She studied the engineer. The council meets again in 3 days, Lucian said finally. Prepare a complete analysis of our northern trade agreements. Every number, every contract, every point of leverage. Alone? Consider it a test. Of my competence or my loyalty? Both. Serafina smiled slightly. Then I'll make sure to pass. She did more than pass. The analysis she produced over the next 3 days revealed corruption, identified 5 exploitable weaknesses in rival territories' supply chains, and proposed 3 strategies for expanding Ravenshallow's influence without military engagement. Lucien read it twice, then called her to his study at midnight. This is exceptional work. That's not a question. No, it's a problem. He set down the documents. You're too valuable to remain a guest. Serafina's expression became carefully neutral. What are you proposing? Official position, trade advisor, full access to council meetings and strategic planning, permanent quarters in the keep. And in exchange, absolute loyalty, complete discretion, and understanding that once you occupy this position, leaving becomes significantly more complicated. She understood immediately. He was offering her real power, but power that came with golden chains. Accept. And she became indispensable to Raven's Hollow's operation. Refuse, and she returned to irrelevance. The estates? Return to your name after 1 year of proven service. Serafina moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond Raven's Hollow's walls. Lucien waited, recognizing this as the genuine decision point. Everything before had been maneuvering. This was the moment she chose her future. Finally, she turned back. I have 2 additional conditions. The audacity remained breathtaking. State them. First, I attend all council meetings without exception. No locked doors, no private conversations I'm excluded from. Impossible. Some matters require, if you trust me with trade secrets and military intelligence, you trust me with everything. Otherwise, this is a decorative position and I'm not interested. Lucien weighed the demand. Complete transparency meant vulnerability, but it also meant eliminating any suspicion that he was manipulating her through selective information. Agreed. Second condition? I maintain autonomy over my personal life, who I speak with, where I go within the keep, how I spend private hours. I'm not a prisoner. You'll be watched. Everyone here is watched. Serafina crossed her arms. I'm asking for the same freedom you grant your advisors. My advisors have earned trust over decades. Then I'll earn it faster. The confidence should have been insufferable. Instead, Lucien found it compelling in ways he didn't fully understand. She was negotiating like an equal, despite having zero leverage beyond her intelligence. And perhaps that was the point. Serafina Arden understood that her value lay precisely in refusing to be another terrified subordinate. She would provide honest analysis, uncomfortable truths, the kind of counsel that required courage to deliver. Accepted. Lucien extended his hand. Welcome to Raven's Hollow, Lady Arden. She shook it firmly, and the deal was sealed. Neither of them recognized that moment as the beginning of something that would eventually consume them both. Winter deepened its grip on Raven's Hollow as Serafina integrated into the court's daily machinery. She attended council meetings before dawn, spent afternoons analyzing trade agreements and military logistics, and somehow found time to correct the mathematical errors in budget projections that lazy ministers had submitted for years. The servants whispered about her, the lady who walked alongside the Duke, who challenged his judgments in front of nobles too terrified to breathe loudly, who somehow survived each dangerous encounter and returned the next day even more firmly embedded in Raven's Hollow's operations. But Lucien noticed what the servants didn't. Serafina wasn't surviving through submission. She was surviving by becoming indispensable. When corrupt magistrates sent falsified reports, she exposed them. When border disputes threatened military escalation, she found diplomatic solutions that Lucien's aggressive reputation made possible. When assassination plots emerged from rival territories, she identified the conspirators before violence reached Raven's Hollow's gates. And slowly, dangerously, Lucien began delegating actual authority to her. It started small, approval over trade contracts, input on military positioning, then gradually expanded until Serafina was making decisions that affected thousands of lives across the northern territories. The nobles noticed, and began recalculating their positions accordingly. One evening, Lord Ashford approached Lucien after a particularly brutal council session where Serafina had eviscerated a proposal for unnecessary military spending. My lord, if I may speak candidly. Lucien gestured permission. Lady Arden holds considerable influence over court decisions. Some feel she's gained too much power too quickly. Some. Lucien's voice carried lethal softness. Name them. Ashford backpedaled immediately. General concern, nothing specific. We simply wonder about appropriate boundaries given her family's history. Her family's history is irrelevant compared to her present value. Lucien stepped closer. Unless you're suggesting she's provided poor counsel. No, my lord. Her analysis has been flawless. Lucien finished the sentence, which means your concerns reflect personal discomfort rather than legitimate strategic worry. I suggest you overcome that discomfort quickly. The message was clear. Serafina Arden enjoyed the Duke's protection, challenge her, and face consequences. Ashford retreated with pale understanding, but the confrontation highlighted something Lucian had been avoiding acknowledging. His protection of Serafina had extended beyond strategic necessity into something more dangerous. He defended her not because she was useful, but because attacks against her felt personal. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking the castle corridors and somehow ending up outside her quarters. Light showed beneath the door. Working late again, probably reviewing tomorrow's agenda. He should have returned to his chambers. Instead, he knocked. Serafina opened the door, still dressed, papers scattered across every surface of her room. Duke Vale. Surprise flickered across her features. Is something wrong? Why are you still awake? Same reason you're walking the halls at midnight instead of sleeping. Too much to analyze. She stepped aside and Lucian entered without invitation. The room was organized chaos. Maps on one wall, trade figures on another, correspondence arranged by priority across her desk. You're working on Lord Wren's coalition, trying to find the pressure points. He's gathering support carefully, promising independence from Ravens Hollow's expansion, access to royal trade routes, protection from your retribution. And he's good. Better than your current intelligence suggests. Serafina gestured to her notes. He's not just bribing nobles. He's building genuine alliances based on shared fear of your growing power. Lucian studied the map where she'd marked territories aligned with Wren. More than he'd expected. Recommendations? Don't destroy him publicly. That confirms everything he's saying about you. Instead, isolate him gradually. Offer better terms to his weaker allies. Let them betray him naturally. That takes time. Yes, but crushing him immediately starts a war you don't need. This way, he becomes the problem his own coalition has to solve. The strategy was elegant, sophisticated. Everything Lucian's reputation suggested he would never choose, which made it perfect. Implement it. He moved to the window, staring out at snow-covered grounds. Through your channels, not mine. If this succeeds, Wren's collapse needs to look like internal failure. Understood. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken recognition that these late-night strategy sessions had become routine, that they'd begun relying on each other's judgment without conscious decision. You've changed Ravens Hollow, Lucian said finally. I've provided alternative perspectives. No. You've made me reconsider how power works. He turned to face her. Fear is effective, but expensive. What you do, making people choose cooperation because the alternative is clearly worse without needing to demonstrate it constantly. That's sustainable. Serafina met his gaze steadily. Are you saying I've softened you? I'm saying you've made me more dangerous by making me less predictable. Good. She returns to her papers. Predictable tyrants get overthrown eventually. Strategic rulers build dynasties. The word dynasty hung in the air with implications neither acknowledged directly. Lucien should have left then. Should have maintained the professional distance that had already eroded more than was safe. Instead, he found himself asking, do you still hate me for what happened to your family? Serafina's hand stilled over her documents. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then quietly, I don't hate you. I understand you. Which is more terrifying than hatred because it means I recognize myself in your calculations. What are you saying? I'm saying we're not as different as I initially believed. You destroy obstacles. I manipulate outcomes. The methods differ, but the fundamental approach to power is identical. She looked up. That's why this works. Why you trust me. Because I think like you do. The admission felt like touching exposed blade. Lucien crossed the room slowly until he stood directly in front of her desk. And does that frighten you? Every day. Serafina's voice remained steady despite visible tension. Because I came here planning to reclaim my family's estates and leave. But now I'm embedded in the machinery of Ravens Hollow and starting to enjoy it. Enjoying power isn't a sin. No, but becoming addicted to it is dangerous. More dangerous than catching the attention of the Duke of Ravens Hollow? Significantly. She stood, meeting him eye to eye. Because your attention comes with expectations I'm not certain I want to fulfill. The honesty was devastating, raw. Everything the court's political theater usually concealed beneath layers of manipulation. Lucien should have backed away, should have reasserted professional boundaries, should have done anything except what he actually did, which was reach out and touch her face with surprising gentleness. What if the expectations are mutual? Serafina didn't retreat. Then we're both walking toward a cliff and pretending we don't see the edge. Perhaps. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Or perhaps we recognize that falling is inevitable and choose it anyway. The kiss happened with neither quite initiating it first. Just sudden collision of intention and desire that had been building through months of intellectual sparring and dangerous respect. When they finally broke apart, Serafina's breathing was unsteady, but her gaze remained clear. This complicates everything. Yes, the court will use it against us. Absolutely. And you're still going to pursue this. Lucien smiled without warmth. I don't pursue things, Lady Arden. I claim them. Then understand that I don't submit easily. I don't want submission. He stepped back deliberately. I want the woman who demolished 3 ministers before breakfast and told me I was wrong about military expenditures. Don't soften that for anyone, including me. With that, he left before either could say something that would make retreat impossible. But the damage was already done. The next morning, the entire court sensed the shift even without witnesses to the previous night. Something had changed in the way Duke Lucien Vale looked at Lady Serafina Arden. Something that made powerful nobles recalculate their positions, and servants whisper behind closed doors about the woman who had tamed Ravenshallow's monster. They were wrong, of course. Serafina hadn't tamed anything. She'd simply taught the monster where to aim its teeth. And Lucien Vale had discovered something more dangerous than fear. He'd found someone worth keeping. The morning after arrived, wrapped in consequences neither Lucien nor Serafina had adequately prepared for. Dawn broke cold across Ravenshallow's battlements, while servants moved through corridors carrying whispers faster than official dispatches. The Duke had been seen leaving Lady Arden's quarters after midnight. The atmosphere during breakfast council had shifted from professional tension to something far more volatile. Lucien noticed immediately. He'd built his empire on reading rooms, understanding when fear transformed into opportunity, recognizing the exact moment allies became threats. Today, every noble in the Great Hall watched him with calculation that went beyond standard political maneuvering. They smelled weakness, or thought they did. Serafina entered precisely at dawn wearing deep burgundy, took her usual seat beside the Duke's chair and proceeded to dismantle Lord Blackwood's tariff proposal with surgical precision. Her voice remained steady, her analysis flawless. But Lucien caught the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped documents slightly too hard. She felt it too, the shift, the unspoken judgment radiating from nobles who believed they'd discovered leverage. The meeting concluded without incident, but Cassian Morholt remained afterward, waiting until the chamber emptied before approaching. My lord, we need to discuss the situation. Lucien continued reviewing reports without looking up. Which situation? Don't insult my intelligence. The entire court knows you've become involved with Lady Arden. My personal affairs aren't council business. They are when they affect your political standing. Cassian moved closer, voice dropping. 3 nobles approached me this morning asking if the Duke of Ravenshollow has become distracted by a woman. 4 more inquired whether Lady Arden now controls policy decisions. This is exactly the vulnerability I warned you about. Lucien finally met his advisor's gaze. What exactly are you suggesting? Distance. Publicly. Reassign her to administrative duties away from strategic meetings. Make it clear she's a competent advisor, but nothing more. The suggestion landed like a blade between ribs. Not because it was unreasonable. Strategically, Cassian's counsel made perfect sense. Weakness invited attacks. Personal attachments created exploitable pressure points. Everything Lucien had built required maintaining the appearance of absolute control unmarred by sentiment. But something had changed in the architecture of his priorities, and even Lucien wasn't entirely certain when the transformation had occurred. No. Cassian's expression flickered with surprise. My lord, Lady Arden remains in her current position with full authority. Anyone questioning that arrangement can address their concerns directly to me. That's precisely what I'm trying to prevent. If you defend her too aggressively, it confirms their suspicions that she's become a liability rather than an asset. Then they'll learn a valuable lesson about what happens when they mistake strategic evolution for weakness. Lucian stood, gathering his papers. Serafina has made Ravenshollow more efficient, exposed corruption you failed to identify, and provided analysis that prevented two unnecessary conflicts. Her value is measurable and documented. Anyone claiming otherwise is projecting their own inadequacy. And your feelings for her? Are those also measurable? The question hung in the sudden silence like drawn steel. Lucian studied his oldest advisor carefully. Cassian had served faithfully for 15 years, had never questioned major decisions, had proven his loyalty through countless situations requiring absolute discretion. But something in his tone now carried an edge that went beyond professional concern. My feelings are irrelevant. Results matter. She produces results. She produces complications. Cassian's voice hardened slightly. You've spent decades building an empire based on fear and calculated ruthlessness. Now nobles are whispering that a disgraced woman has softened the Duke of Ravenshollow. That's not strategy. That's vulnerability. Dismissed. The single word carried enough ice to freeze blood. Cassian hesitated, recognized he'd pushed too far, and retreated with stiff formality. But the damage was done. The conversation had exposed something Lucian had been avoiding acknowledging, that his protection of Serafina had become visible enough to register as weakness among people who viewed any deviation from brutal consistency as opportunity. He found her an hour later in the strategy room reviewing intelligence reports on Lord Wren's expanding coalition. We have a problem. Serafina looked up immediately. Cassian talked to you. You knew he would. He cornered me yesterday morning, suggested I request reassignment before the court uses our involvement against you. She set down her papers. I assume you refused his advice. Obviously. That was a mistake. The blunt assessment caught Lucian off guard. Explain. Serafina stood, pacing to the window where gray morning light illuminated maps of territories stretching across 3 provinces. You've built your power through predictable ruthlessness. Everyone knows what to expect from the Duke of Ravenshollow. Overwhelming force, zero tolerance for weakness, absolute control. That predictability creates stability even among your enemies. And now you're behaving unpredictably, defending me publicly, allowing me influence that contradicts your established pattern of trusting no one. That unpredictability makes people nervous, and nervous nobles become dangerous nobles. Lucian crossed the room slowly. You're suggesting I distance myself from you. I'm suggesting we recognize reality. This arrangement works professionally because my analysis is valuable. But the moment it becomes personal, that value gets contaminated by perception of weakness. You think defending you demonstrates weakness. I think defending me more aggressively than strategic necessity makes you vulnerable to exactly the kind of political maneuvering you've spent your life avoiding. Serafina met his gaze directly. I'm not worth destroying your empire over. The statement should have been logical, pragmatic, everything Lucian had trained himself to prioritize. Instead, it ignited something in him that bypassed logic entirely. Don't tell me what you're worth. Someone has to maintain perspective. You think I don't understand the political implications? I've been calculating power dynamics since before you knew what court politics meant. Lucian moved closer, voice dropping to lethal softness. The nobles whisper because they're testing whether they can exploit this. Let them test. When they fail, the lesson becomes permanent. And if they don't fail, if Lord Wren uses this to accelerate his coalition, if ministers start coordinating against us because they believe you've become compromised, then we crush them the same way we've crushed every other threat, together. He touched her face with unexpected gentleness despite the steel in his voice. I didn't survive this long by abandoning strategic assets because maintaining them became politically inconvenient. I'm not just a strategic asset anymore. No. You're not. The admission felt like tearing open armor he'd spent decades forging. But that doesn't change the fundamental calculation. You make me more effective, not less. Anyone who can't see that difference is too stupid to threaten us. Serafina studied him with those unsettling gray eyes that saw through every defense he'd constructed. You're choosing sentiment over strategy. I'm choosing evolution over stagnation. There's a difference. Dates. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, this looks exactly like the kind of emotional decision you've spent your life avoiding. Juice. The challenge hit harder than any physical blow, because she was right. Lucien Vale had built his empire on eliminating emotional variables from strategic calculations. Personal attachments were liabilities. Sentiment was weakness. Control required isolation. Yet here he stood, defending a woman he'd known for months against the accumulated wisdom of 15 years of successful brutality. The contradiction should have been unacceptable. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. Maybe, Lucien admitted quietly, maybe this is the worst decision I've ever made. Maybe protecting you will destroy everything I've built, but I'm choosing it anyway because for the first time in my life, something matters more than absolute control. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence that followed was Serafina's expression cycled through surprise, understanding, then something that looked dangerously like fear. Don't say things like that. Why not? Because it makes walking away impossible, and walking away might be the smart choice. Then don't walk away. Lucian's hands framed her face. Stay. Fight beside me. Let them test us and discover exactly how dangerous we are together. You're asking me to burn bridges I might need later. But I'm asking you to burn them with me and build something better from the ashes. The kiss happened slower this time. Deliberate. A conscious choice made in full understanding of consequences neither could predict but both accepted anyway. When they separated, Serafina's breathing was unsteady but her voice remained clear. This is insane. Probably. We're going to make enemies of everyone. We already have enemies. Now they'll just be more motivated. And you think that's acceptable? Lucien smiled without warmth. I think it's inevitable. So we might as well choose it on our terms. The decision was made. No going back. Whatever political fallout followed would have to be managed through force and strategy rather than retreat. That evening, Lucien made his position brutally clear during a formal dinner attended by every major noble in Ravenshallow's court. When Lord Ashford made a veiled comment about advisors wielding inappropriate influence, Lucian's response was surgical and devastating. Lord Ashford, your last financial report contained 17 errors that Lady Arden corrected before they reached my desk. Your military requisitions have been inflated by 20% for the past 6 months, skimming funds you assumed I wouldn't notice. And your nephew currently sits in my dungeon awaiting trial for smuggling contraband through my territories. Lucian's voice remained conversational despite every word landing like a hammer. So when you question Lady Arden's influence, understand that you're comparing her documented competence against your proven corruption. Which would you prefer I emphasize? Ashford went white. The table went silent. Message delivered. Crystal clear. Attack Serafina and discover exactly how much ammunition the Duke had been quietly accumulating against potential enemies. Serafina caught his eye across the table. A slight nod. Acknowledgement that he'd just declared open war on anyone who threatened her position. The rest of dinner proceeded with uncomfortable politeness, while nobles recalculated their positions. Some would retreat, recognizing the Duke's commitment was absolute. Others would dig deeper, believing the vulnerability was real and exploitable. Either way, the battle lines were drawn. Later that night, alone in his chambers, Lucien stood at the window watching torchlight flicker across Ravenshallow's grounds. Cassian's concerns echoed in his thoughts. The strategic risks were real. By defending Serafina so aggressively, he'd created exactly the kind of political target his enemies had been searching for. But retreat now would be worse than pressing forward. It would confirm weakness without eliminating the threat. Better to commit fully and demonstrate that attacking Lady Arden meant facing the full brutality of Ravenshallow's Duke without restraint. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Serafina entered without waiting for invitation, still dressed from dinner, carrying documents. Lord Wren's latest move. He's positioning it as concern for your judgment rather than direct opposition. Lucien took the papers, scanning the carefully worded letter that questioned whether the Duke of Ravenshollow was allowing personal matters to cloud strategic thinking. Clever. He's not attacking you directly. No, he's attacking your credibility through implication, forcing you to either prove your judgment is sound by distancing yourself from me, or defend the relationship and confirm his narrative that you've become compromised. Classic political trap. Extremely effective one. Serafina moved to the window beside him. How do you want to respond? By making him regret creating the trap in the first place. Lucien set down the papers. You identified 5 vulnerable points in his coalition 3 weeks ago. Time to exploit them. Simultaneously? Within 48 hours. I want his entire support structure questioning whether allying with Ren is worth the cost. That's aggressive. That's the point. We don't defend against accusations of poor judgment. We demonstrate judgment so ruthlessly effective that questioning it becomes absurd. Serafina studied him carefully. You're using this as an excuse to destroy him completely. I'm using his mistake as opportunity to eliminate a long-term threat while making an example that discourages future challenges. Lucien turned to face her fully. Lucien, the accusations against us are going to continue regardless. Better to make them expensive. And if it backfires, if destroying Ren rallies more opposition, then we destroy them too, until the cost of opposing Ravenshollow becomes so catastrophic that even ambitious nobles recognize the futility. The strategy was pure Lucien Vale, overwhelming force, zero compromise, complete devastation of anything resembling organized resistance. But Serafina heard something else beneath the tactical analysis. Anger. Personal investment. The kind of emotional response he'd spent his life eliminating from strategic calculations. You're taking this personally. Of course I am. No deflection. Pure honesty. He attacked you by attacking my judgment. That makes it personal. That's exactly what he wants. To prove you've become emotionally compromised. Let him try to prove it while his coalition collapses and his allies abandon him. Lucien's smile carried no warmth. By the time we're finished, Lord Ren will serve as a lesson about what happens when people mistake evolution for weakness. Serafina should have argued, should have counseled patience and measured response, should have done anything except what she actually did, which was step closer and kiss him with the kind of intensity that acknowledged they'd both chosen a path that might destroy them. When they broke apart, her voice was steady despite visible tension. I'm trusting you with my life. I know. If this fails, we both go down. Then we make certain it doesn't fail. Lucien pulled her closer. You wanted to reclaim your family's position. I'm offering you something better. Power that doesn't depend on inherited titles or political favor. Real influence built through competence and backed by force. At what cost? Everything we were before. But I was a lonely tyrant ruling through fear, and you were a disgraced noble with no future. Is that really worth preserving? The question struck deep. Because he was right. They'd both been surviving rather than living, maintaining careful distance from anything that could be weaponized by enemies. Now they were choosing vulnerability, deliberately, with full understanding that it created exactly the kind of leverage both had spent their lives avoiding. No, Serafina admitted quietly. It's not worth preserving. Then stop arguing strategy and help me plan Ren's destruction. They worked through the night, transforming political threat into coordinated counterattack. By dawn, they'd identified exactly how to dismantle Ren's coalition through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic pressure that would leave him isolated and humiliated. The first strike landed 48 hours later when Lord Pemberton, Ren's primary financial backer, suddenly withdrew support after discovering his own son was being investigated for embezzlement. Investigation that Lucien had quietly initiated months earlier, but only now chose to make public. The second strike came 12 hours after that, when 3 minor nobles who'd pledged loyalty to Ren received significantly better trade agreements from Ravenshollow on the condition they sever all ties with anyone opposing the Duke's court. The third strike was pure information warfare. Documents surfaced proving Ren had been embezzling crown funds while claiming financial hardship. Real documents, carefully acquired through channels Serafina had established, released with timing that made defense impossible. Within a week, Lord Wren's coalition wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. Nobles who'd promised support fled to neutral positions. Ministers who'd whispered encouragement suddenly claimed they'd always opposed him. Even Wren's own family began distancing themselves from the scandal. The Duke of Ravenshollow had responded to political maneuvering with such devastating efficiency that the entire aristocracy received the message loud and clear. Question his judgment at your own catastrophic risk. But Cassian Morholt watched the destruction with growing concern. During a private meeting in Lucy's study, he finally voiced what others only dared think. My lord, this response was excessive. It was proportional to the threat. It was personal. Cassian's voice hardened. You destroyed Wren completely because he questioned your relationship with Lady Arden. That's not strategy. That's emotion. Results are results regardless of motivation. Yet Imaim sets. No. Motivation matters because it predicts future behavior. Cassian leaned forward. You're changing, my lord, becoming something different than the man who built this empire. And I'm not certain the change is sustainable. Lucian set down his papers slowly. Are you questioning my judgment? I'm questioning whether your judgment is still reliable when it involves Lady Arden. The accusation hung between them, like drawn steel. For 15 years, Cassian had been the one person Lucian trusted with complete honesty. The advisor who'd stood beside him through every brutal decision, every controversial strategy, every moment when ruthlessness was required and sentiment had to be eliminated. Now that advisor was suggesting the foundation had cracked. What exactly are you proposing? Distance. Real distance. Not performative gestures, but actual separation, until the court stabilizes and stops viewing Lady Arden as your primary vulnerability. And if I refuse? Cassian's expression hardened. Then I'm watching you repeat the same mistake that destroyed your father. He trusted the wrong person, gave them influence they used to weaken him. By the time he recognized the error, recovery was impossible. Serafina is nothing like that situation. No? She appeared at court with nothing. You gave her access, authority, and eventually your protection. Now she influences policy decisions and you're making enemies defending her position. How is that different? The comparison was unfair, and Cassian knew it, but the underlying concern was valid enough to create doubt. Lucien's father had been destroyed by misplaced trust. His empire had collapsed because he'd allowed sentiment to override strategic calculation. Was he making the same mistake? Had Serafina Arden become the vulnerability his enemies needed? Dismissed. Cassian stood stiffly. I've served you faithfully for 15 years, my lord. Everything I've done has been to protect and strengthen Ravenshollow. Don't let pride blind you to legitimate concerns. He left before Lucien could respond. He left before Lucien. The conversation gnawed at Lucien through the following days. Not because Cassian's concerns were necessarily correct, but because they highlighted the fundamental shift that had occurred. He was making decisions based partially on emotional investment rather than pure strategic calculation. That had always been unacceptable before. So why did it feel right now? Serafina noticed immediately. Over dinner 3 nights later, she set down her wine with deliberate care. You're avoiding me. I'm managing the political situation. You're doubting us. No accusation, pure observation. Cassian got to you. Lucien met her gaze across the table. He raised valid concerns about strategic liability and emotional compromise. And you're considering them seriously. I'd be a fool not to consider counsel from my most trusted advisor, Sa. Then let me offer alternative counsel. Serafina leaned forward. Yes, I'm a liability. Yes, defending me creates political complications. Yes, some nobles will view this as weakness worth exploiting. All of that is objectively true. Then what's your argument against distancing? I don't have one. If pure strategy dictates separation, then separate. Send me away. Prove to the court that the Duke of Ravenshollow remains unchanged and untouchable. She paused. But understand what you're actually choosing, not between strength and weakness, between the man you've always been and the man you're capable of becoming. That's not an argument. That's manipulation. Uts. No. Manipulation would be appealing to your feelings. I'm appealing to your intelligence. You've ruled through fear for 15 years. It's been effective, but expensive. Every alliance requires constant reinforcement. Every subordinate needs regular reminders of consequences. You've created stability through exhausting brutality. And there's an alternative model. Not softer, different. Building loyalty through demonstrated value rather than maintained terror. It's slower, requires more trust, creates different vulnerabilities. But it's potentially more sustainable long-term. Lucian studied her carefully. You're suggesting I fundamentally restructure how I maintain power. I'm suggesting you recognize that the old model is reaching its natural limits. You can't personally terrorize every noble in the kingdom indefinitely. Eventually, someone finds the courage or desperation to challenge you, and the cycle repeats. But if you build actual alliances, not based on fear, but on mutual benefit, the empire becomes more resilient, using you as the foundation of that restructuring. Using us as the demonstration, proof that the Duke of Ravenshollow can evolve without losing effectiveness. Seraphina's voice remained steady. But only if you actually commit. Half measures just create the worst of both approaches. The logic was compelling, dangerous. Everything Lucian had trained himself to resist, yet also potentially correct. He'd spent 15 years building an empire that required his constant brutal attention to maintain. What happened when he aged? When his reflexes slowed? When younger, more vicious competitors emerged? Traditional tyranny had a shelf life. Evolution might offer something more sustainable. Or it might be exactly the kind of rationalization that destroyed men who mistook sentiment for strategy. Before Lucien could respond, Captain Thorne entered with urgent dispatch. My lord, Lord Wren has disappeared from his estate. Intelligence suggests he's fled to the capital with evidence of illegal activities conducted by Ravenshollow's agents. The bottom dropped out of carefully maintained control. Lucien stood immediately. What evidence? Blackmail material, bribery records, documentation of the tactics used to dismantle his coalition. Thorne's expression was grim. If he presents it to the royal court, they'll have legitimate grounds to investigate Ravenshollow's operations, which means they'll discover everything. Seraphina's voice was quiet. Every shadow alliance, every questionable tactic, every line you've crossed building this empire. The room went silent as full implications settled. Lord Wren hadn't been defeated. He'd been planning his real attack all along, allowing himself to appear broken while quietly assembling evidence that could bring down the entire structure of Ravenshollow's power. And Lucien had been too focused on defending Seraphina to recognize the trap closing around them both. How long until he reaches the capital? 2 days if he travels quickly? 3 if we're fortunate. Then we have 48 hours to either intercept him or prepare for total war with the crown. Lucien turned to Seraphina. This is what Cassian warned about. I was so focused on protecting you that I missed the real threat. No. Her voice cut through rising panic. You destroyed his political coalition exactly as planned. This is his last desperate move precisely because everything else failed. A last desperate move that could destroy us both. Then we make certain it doesn't succeed. Seraphina stood, moving to the strategy maps on the wall. Wren needs to reach the capital and present evidence before royal officials. That requires 2 things, safe passage and credible presentation. We can disrupt both. How? Same way we've disrupted everything else. Make the cost of helping him higher than the benefit. Every inn, every safe house, every potential ally between here and the capital receives clear message. Shelter Wren and face Ravenshollow's complete retribution. That requires mobilizing our entire intelligence network. Then mobilize it. Seraphina's eyes were cold calculation. And while they're hunting Wren, I'll prepare counter-evidence documenting his embezzlement, his conspiracy, his attempts to undermine legitimate governance. When he arrives at the capital, he won't be a whistleblower. He'll be a disgraced noble making unsubstantiated accusations. Captain Thorne looked between them with visible concern. My lady, Fabricating evidence against a noble is exactly what he's doing to us. Serafina's voice was steel. We're simply making certain our fabrication is more convincing than his truth. The statement hung in the sudden silence. This was the moment. The decision point where strategy crossed definitively into something darker, where protecting their position required abandoning any pretense of ethical restraint. Lucian had crossed such lines countless times before, but always alone, always bearing the moral weight himself. Now Serafina was choosing to cross beside him, fully understanding the cost, accepting it anyway. Do it. Lucian's voice was quiet, both operations simultaneously. I want Ren intercepted before he reaches the capital, but if he succeeds, I want counter-narrative ready to deploy instantly. Thorn saluted and departed immediately. Sami. Thorn saluted, leaving Lucien and Serafina alone with the magnitude of what they'd just committed to. This is the point of no return, Lucien said quietly. I know. If this fails, we both face charges. Execution is probable. I know. Then why are you still here? Serafina moved closer, taking his hands. Because walking away now means everything we've built was pointless. Because I'd rather face execution beside you than survival alone. Because somewhere between court politics and midnight strategy sessions, I stopped calculating the smart choice and started choosing the one that matters. That's not strategy. No. She smiled slightly. It's the opposite. It's commitment without guaranteed outcome. Faith in partnership over individual survival. Everything you've spent your life avoiding. Everything that destroys men who aren't careful. Or builds something worth the risk. Serafina's voice softened. I'm not naive. This could fail catastrophically, but I'm choosing it anyway because the alternative is returning to who we were before. And I don't want that person back. Lucien pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, recognizing that they'd crossed from strategic alliance into something far more dangerous. Territory where failure meant mutual destruction, but success might mean building something unprecedented. An empire based not just on fear, but on the terrifying possibility that two people could become more dangerous together than either had been alone. Outside, snow began falling across Raven's Hollow, while their enemies mobilized in the darkness. The next 48 hours would determine whether the Duke and his advisor had created a dynasty or orchestrated their own spectacular downfall. And neither could retreat now, even if they wanted to. Because the point of no return wasn't when Ren fled with evidence. It was when they'd chosen each other over survival and called it strategy. The 48 hours began with calculated precision. Lucien mobilized every intelligence asset Raven's Hollow had cultivated over 15 years of strategic paranoia. Agents embedded in rival territories received encrypted orders. Safe houses along every major route to the capital were either purchased or threatened into compliance. Merchants who might offer Lord Ren transport suddenly discovered their goods impounded for invented violations. Serafina worked parallel operations from the strategy room, assembling counter-evidence with the methodical brutality of someone who understood that survival required destroying truth itself. Financial records were altered. Testimonies were fabricated. Witnesses who might corroborate Ren's accusations received visits from men who explained very clearly why memory could be unreliable. By the end of the first day, they'd constructed a narrative so comprehensive that Ren's legitimate evidence would look like the desperate fabrications of a disgraced noble trying to deflect from his own corruption. It was masterful, ruthless, everything Lucien had built his reputation on, and it felt like standing at the edge of an abyss neither had fully acknowledged existed. Captain Thorn returned near midnight with the first update. His expression was grim. Ren's moving faster than anticipated. He's bypassed our primary intercept points and is using routes we didn't have covered. Lucien studied the map where new markers showed Ren's unexpected trajectory. He's avoiding major roads entirely, which means someone's guiding him. Someone with detailed knowledge of our intelligence network. The implication hung in the sudden silence. Serafina spoke first. Internal leak. Appears so. Thorn's voice was carefully neutral. Only senior advisors have complete network visibility. That limits potential sources significantly. Lucien's mind moved through calculations with cold precision. His inner circle consisted of exactly 5 people with that level of access. Captain Thorne himself, Minister Caldwell, Lady Seraphina, Lord Ashford, and Cassian Moreholt, the oldest advisor, the most trusted confidant, the man who'd stood beside Lucien for 15 years through every brutal decision and controversial strategy. The man who'd been warning about emotional compromise and strategic vulnerability. No, that conclusion was paranoia speaking. Cassian had proven his loyalty countless times. His recent concerns about Seraphina were legitimate strategic advice, not betrayal. Weren't they? Expand surveillance to include everyone with network access, Lucien ordered. I want movements, conversations, and communications monitored until we identify the leak, including senior advisors, everyone. Thorne departed with visible reluctance. The order meant investigating people who'd served Raven's Hollow faithfully for years, but survival required suspecting everyone until evidence proved otherwise. Seraphina moved to stand beside Lucien at the strategy table. You're thinking it's Cassian. I'm thinking nothing until evidence confirms. Liar. She touched his arm gently. You've already made the connection. Oldest advisor suddenly concerned about your judgment, pushing for separation between us. Perfectly positioned to know our plans and undermine them. Cassian wouldn't. Are you certain? Or are you hoping he wouldn't because accepting his betrayal means your judgment was compromised from the beginning? The question struck deeper than any blade, because she was right. If Cassian had been working against him, it meant Lucien's vaunted ability to read people and assess loyalty had failed catastrophically at the most fundamental level. It meant the foundation of his empire was rotten. If it's him, I'll kill him myself. No. Seraphina's voice was steel. If it's him, we'll need to understand why first. Betrayal of this magnitude requires motivation beyond simple greed or fear. Cassian has something we need to identify before we act. You're defending potential treason. I'm prioritizing information over revenge. They're not the same thing. Lucien wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the brutal certainty that had served him so effectively. But Seraphina's logic was sound. React emotionally. And they'd miss whatever larger conspiracy was unfolding. The second day arrived with worse news. Lord Wren had reached a fortified way station 30 miles from the capital. Intelligence suggested he'd meet with royal ministers within hours. The window for intercept had closed, which meant their survival now depended entirely on the counter-narrative Seraphina had constructed. They were reviewing final preparations when Minister Caldwell arrived with urgent summons. My lord, Cassian requests immediate private audience. He claims to have critical information regarding the Wren situation. Lucien and Seraphina exchanged glances. Either Cassian had identified the leak, or he was about to reveal himself as the source. Both of us, Lucien stated. Lady Arden attends. Caldwell hesitated. He specifically requested private meeting. Then he'll be disappointed. Lucien's tone left no room for negotiation. Inform him we'll receive him in the strategy room. Immediately. Cassian arrived 10 minutes later looking like a man carrying unbearable weight. His usual composed expression had fractured into something approaching desperation. He stopped short when he saw Seraphina present. My lord, what I need to discuss requires absolute discretion. Lady Arden has my complete trust. Speak freely. Cassian's jaw tightened. Very well. Lord Wren's intelligence about our operations didn't come from stolen documents or captured agents. It came from me. The words landed like physical blows. Lucien went absolutely still. Seraphina's hand found his arm in silent support, while the full magnitude of betrayal settled across the room like poison gas. 15 years. 15 years of absolute loyalty, strategic counsel, unwavering support through every brutal decision. And it had been theater. Explain. Lucien's voice was lethal calm. I've been documenting your methods for 3 years. Every questionable tactic, every line crossed, every innocent person crushed in pursuit of power. Cassian's voice carried no apology. You've become exactly what your father warned against. A tyrant so obsessed with control that you've lost sight of anything resembling governance. And you decided to destroy me. I decided to save Raven's Hollow from you. Cassian stepped closer. This empire was supposed to mean something. Stability, protection, fair rule backed by necessary force. Instead, you've transformed it into personal kingdom built on fear and brutality. I built survival. In court, you built a prison. For yourself and everyone trapped in your orbit. Cassian's gaze shifted to Serafina. And then she appeared. The first person in years who might have changed you. But instead of evolution, I watched you double down on the worst aspects of your nature to protect her. Serafina spoke quietly. So you allied with Ren. I gave him the tools to force accountability. The Crown will investigate. They'll discover the truth about Raven's Hollow's operations. And they'll dismantle the Empire before it consumes the entire region. They'll execute us both. Lucian's voice was cold stone. Probably. Cassian met his gaze without flinching. But sometimes that's the price of stopping monsters before they destroy everything worth preserving. The silence that followed was absolute. Lucian's mind raced through implications with mechanical precision. Cassian's betrayal meant every strategy for the past 3 years had been compromised. Every secret meeting potentially documented. Every questionable tactic recorded for eventual use against him. The counter-narrative Serafina had constructed was worthless. Cassian would have counter evidence proving their fabrications were fabrications. They were finished. Unless, "Why are you here?" Serafina asked suddenly. "If your goal was destroying us, why arrive in person to confess? You could have stayed silent and let the Crown's investigation proceed." Cassian's expression flickered with something that might have been regret. Because despite everything, I spent 15 years believing in the man Lucian could have become. I'm offering final chance for honorable resolution. Which is? Voluntary exile. Both of you. Leave Raven's Hollow tonight. I'll tell the Crown you fled before investigation concluded. Your empire collapses, but you survive. Separately, in different territories, starting over with nothing. Separately. Lucian's voice was dead calm. You want us to abandon everything and split apart. I want you to have the life your brutality doesn't deserve. But only if you accept that this version of Raven's Hollow dies tonight. The offer hung in the air like drawn steel. Survival. At the cost of everything they'd built, everything they'd become together. Lucian looked at Serafina, saw the calculation in her eyes, the ruthless pragmatism that matched his own. They could accept exile, start over in separate territories, live, quiet lives away from the machinery of power. It was the smart choice, the strategic decision, everything their training demanded. Serafina spoke first, voice steady. No. Cassian's expression hardened. You're refusing exile. We're refusing surrender. She turned to Lucien. He thinks we're trapped because the Crown has evidence and counter-evidence proves nothing. But he's forgotten the fundamental principle of power, which is, evidence only matters if there's someone left alive to present it. The statement hung in sudden silence while full implications crystallized. Cassian went pale. You're planning to kill Ren before he reaches the capital. We're planning to eliminate every threat simultaneously. Serafina's voice was ice. Ren, the royal ministers he's meeting, anyone who's seen the evidence, complete surgical removal of the entire conspiracy before dawn. That's mass murder. That's survival. Lucian's voice matched hers. You've spent 3 years documenting my brutality. Tonight, you'll discover exactly how brutal I can be when everything is at stake. Cassian stepped back. I won't let you... Well, Captain Thorne entered silently behind him. The blade was quick, professional. Cassian slumped forward with shocked expression frozen on his features. Lucien caught him before he hit the floor. 15 years of loyalty and betrayal reduced to weight in his arms. The oldest friend he'd had. The advisor who'd stood beside him through everything. Dead on the strategy room floor because trust was weakness, and weakness invited exactly this kind of destruction. Dispose of it. Lucien's voice was empty. Quietly. Thorne and 2 guards removed the body with practiced efficiency, leaving Lucien and Serafina alone, with blood spreading slowly across ancient stone. She touched his shoulder gently. Are you? Fine. The lie was automatic. We have 4 hours until Ren meets royal ministers. Mobilize assassination teams. Everyone who's seen evidence dies tonight. No survivors, no witnesses. Complete elimination. Lucien, what? He turned on her with sudden fury. You suggested this strategy. You recognized we had no choice except overwhelming violence. So either commit to it or get out of my way. Serafina didn't flinch. I'm committed. But you just killed your oldest friend. Taking 60 seconds to acknowledge that isn't weakness. Yes, it is. Lucien moved to the window, staring out at darkness. Acknowledging it means feeling it. Feeling it means hesitation. Hesitation gets us killed. So we execute the plan and process the emotional fallout after we've survived. That's not healthy. That's realistic. You wanted to understand how I've ruled for 15 years? This is how. By compartmentalizing brutality until survival is secured, then dealing with consequences in private. Alone. Always alone. He turned back. Because sharing that burden means creating vulnerability someone like Cassian can exploit. I'm not Cassian. No, you arrived with nothing. I gave you access, authority, protection. Exactly what Cassian warned about, exactly the pattern that nearly destroyed us. Lucien's voice was razor-edged. So forgive me if I'm suddenly questioning every relationship I've allowed to become more than transactional. The accusation landed like physical blow. Serafina went very still. You think I'm manipulating you? I think I stopped calculating costs when you entered my life and nearly lost everything as a result. That suggests either genuine emotional compromise or extraordinarily sophisticated manipulation. Right now, I can't distinguish between them. Then make a choice. Trust me or don't. But do it now because we have 4 hours to coordinate multiple assassinations across 30 miles of hostile territory. Wavering gets us both killed. Whoa! Lucien studied her with the cold assessment he'd once applied to all potential threats, looking for tells, microexpressions, any sign that her commitment was performance rather than genuine alliance. He saw nothing except exhausted determination and the same pragmatic brutality he recognized in himself, which proved exactly nothing. The best manipulators were indistinguishable from genuine partners right up until the knife entered your back. But they were out of time for existential doubt. Coordinate assassination teams, Lucien ordered. Everyone with knowledge of Cassian's evidence dies within the next 4 hours. Ren, the ministers, every servant, guard, or bystander who might have overheard conversations. Eliminate the entire knowledge base. That's 40 to 60 people. Then we'd better move quickly. Serafina held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, then nodded and departed to begin coordination. Leaving Lucien alone with spreading bloodstain and the recognition that he'd just ordered mass murder to preserve an empire that might not be worth preserving. But retreat was impossible now. Forward was the only direction remaining. The next 3 hours became choreographed violence, executed with mechanical precision. Teams deployed to intercept targets. Blades found throats in the darkness. Bodies disappeared into carefully prepared graves. The machinery of assassination that Lucien had spent years refining operated at peak efficiency. By the time false dawn lightened the eastern sky, 43 people were dead. Lord Ren, 6 royal ministers, 17 servants and guards, 10 witnesses who'd been in wrong place at wrong time, 3 of Cassian's relatives who might have known about his documentation, comprehensive elimination, 0 survivors. The evidence was gone, the witnesses silenced. The conspiracy erased as though it had never existed. Lucien received confirmation reports with dead expression while Serafina stood beside him, marking each completed objective. It's done, she said finally. Is it? Well, every target confirmed, eliminated. Cassian's documentation destroyed. No remaining evidence links us to anything. Except the 43 bodies. Buried, scattered, disappeared into the machinery we've spent years building for exactly this purpose. Serafina's voice was steady despite visible exhaustion. We survived, Waunka. Did we? Lucien turned to face her. Or did we just prove Cassian was right, that I've become exactly the monster he documented? Does it matter? Yes, because if he was right, then everything I've built is exactly what he claimed, a prison, for me and everyone trapped in my orbit. Serafina moved closer. Then change it. How? By pretending tonight didn't happen? By ignoring the fact that I just ordered mass murder to protect my position? By recognizing that you can't go back to what you were, only forward into what you choose to become. She took his hands. Cassian's betrayal proved your old model is unsustainable. Pure brutality creates enemies faster than you can eliminate them. So evolve, or eventually someone will succeed where he failed. Evolution requires trust. I just murdered my most trusted advisor. Because he betrayed that trust. But I haven't. Serafina's voice was steel beneath exhaustion. I could have warned Cassian you suspected him. Could have fled with evidence of my own. Could have aligned with Ren for protection. I chose you instead. Repeatedly. Through every decision point tonight. Why? Because despite everything, you're capable of becoming something better than what you are. And I'd rather build that future together than survive safely alone. Lucien studied her with the assessment that had kept him alive through 15 years of political warfare, looking for deception, finding only exhausted honesty, or the appearance of honesty sophisticated enough to fool even his paranoid scrutiny. The distinction was unknowable, so he made a choice based not on certainty, but on something more fundamental, the recognition that absolute isolation was its own kind of death, that ruling through fear alone was unsustainable. That Cassian's final accusation contained uncomfortable truth regardless of his betrayal. If you're manipulating me, it's the most impressive long-term strategy I've ever witnessed. And if I'm not? Then we just survived an extinction-level event together and might actually be capable of building something unprecedented. Serafina smiled slightly despite everything. Those are our options. Sophisticated betrayal or genuine partnership. You have to choose which you believe. That's not how trust works, right? No, that's exactly how trust works. How? Choosing to believe despite inability to verify. Taking the risk anyway, because the alternative is worse. Lucien pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, recognizing that they'd crossed another line tonight. Not just into mass murder, that was familiar territory, but into mutual dependence that felt simultaneously like salvation and trap. The Crown will investigate anyway, he said quietly. 43 people don't disappear without questions. Let them question. Without evidence or witnesses, investigation produces nothing. We maintain innocence. Suggest Ren fled from legitimate prosecution. Point to Cassian's disappearance as possible conspiracy neither of us were aware of. Deflection and misdirection. Standard strategy you've used successfully for 15 years. Serafina looked up at him. The difference now is you're not executing it alone. The statement should have been comforting. Instead, it highlighted exactly what Cassian had warned about, that Lucien Vale had allowed another person into the machinery of his decision-making, that he'd become dependent on Serafina's counsel in ways that created exploitable vulnerability, that he'd fundamentally changed from the isolated tyrant who'd built Raven's Hollow through pure ruthless autonomy. Whether that change represented evolution or fatal compromise remained unclear. But morning was coming. The Crown's investigation would begin within days, and they had to present unified front regardless of internal doubt. Convene emergency council, Lucien ordered. We need to establish official narrative before rumors spread. The council meeting that followed was theater performed for nobles who sensed blood in the water. Lucien announced that Lord Ren had fled to avoid prosecution for embezzlement. The Cassian Morholt had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, possibly related to the same conspiracy. That Raven's Hollow remained stable despite attempts to undermine legitimate governance. The nobles listened with carefully neutral expressions while calculating new power dynamics. Some would retreat. Others would test whether the Duke's grip had genuinely weakened. Lord Ashford was first to challenge. My lord, Lord Ren's flight suggests significant concern about what investigation might uncover. Perhaps independent audit would Independent audit would waste resources pursuing baseless accusations from a disgraced embezzler. Lucien's voice was cold precision. But if you're volunteering to fund such investigation from your personal treasury, Lord Ashford, I'm certain the council would appreciate your generous contribution to proving my innocence. Ashford went pale. I didn't mean to suggest. Then don't suggest. Ren fled because he knew his crimes would be exposed. Cassian disappeared for reasons we're still investigating. Everything else is speculation by people hoping chaos creates opportunity. The message was clear. Test the Duke's weakened position and discover his teeth remain sharp. No one else challenged. But Lucien recognized the temporary nature of intimidation. Eventually, someone would gather enough courage or desperation to probe whether Ravenshallow's foundation had cracked. And when that happened, his response would need to demonstrate that mass murder hadn't weakened him. It had simply removed his remaining hesitation about using overwhelming force. After the council dispersed, Lucien found himself standing alone in the great hall where his ancestors' portraits watched with painted judgment. 15 dukes before him. Most had ruled through brutality. Several had died violently. One had been assassinated by his own advisors after becoming too paranoid to function. That was the path he'd been walking. Isolation, suspicion, increasing brutality to compensate for eroding trust. Cassian had recognized it, had tried to stop it through betrayal. The irony was devastating. The advisor who'd stood faithfully beside him for 15 years had destroyed that faith by trying to save Ravenshollow from what Lucien was becoming. Serafina entered quietly, standing beside him in the empty hall. "You're wondering if he was right." "I'm wondering if killing 43 people to preserve my empire makes me the monster he documented." "Probably." She took his hand, but monsters aren't born. They're created by circumstances that reward brutality over compassion. You became what survival required. That's not absolution. No, it's explanation. What you do next determines whether you remain that monster or evolve into something different. And you believe evolution is possible. I believe you just survived betrayal by your oldest advisor and coordinated mass assassination without hesitation. That's not evolution. That's regression into your worst tendencies. Serafina turned to face him directly. So yes, I believe evolution is possible, but only if you actively choose it instead of defaulting to brutality whenever you're threatened. This brutality works temporarily, but Cassian proved that even perfect brutality creates enemies patient enough to wait for opportunity. You need a different model, or eventually someone will succeed. The model you're suggesting requires trust I just murdered. No, it requires building new trust despite what just happened. Learning from Cassian's betrayal instead of letting it confirm your worst instincts. Lucien studied the portraits of dead dukes. And if I can't, if tonight proved I'm fundamentally incapable of the evolution you're describing, then Ravenshollow eventually falls and we both die violently, probably within 5 years. Serafina's voice was matter-of-fact. But I'm betting you're capable of more than your history suggests. Otherwise, I wouldn't still be here. That's a terrible bet. Probably, but I've already committed to it. So either prove me right or prove me wrong, but make the choice deliberately instead of defaulting to isolated brutality. The challenge hung between them in the empty hall. Lucien recognized this as the genuine decision point. Not whether to survive tonight, they'd managed that through overwhelming violence. But whether to continue the path that had required murdering his oldest friend or attempt fundamental transformation. One path was familiar, brutal, unsustainable but proven effective in short term. The other was unknown, required trusting someone who might be manipulating him. Demanded evolution he wasn't certain he was capable of achieving. I don't know how to be anything except what I am. Then learn. Serafina's voice softened slightly. With me. Together. Building something that doesn't require murdering everyone who questions your judgment. That's not a strategy. That's faith. Sometimes they're the same thing. Lucien wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the certainty that had kept him alive through 15 years of political warfare. But Cassian's corpse and 43 other bodies proved that certainty was illusion. The old model was dying whether he acknowledged it or not. So he made a choice that terrified him more than any battle or assassination. Help me change. 3 words. Simple. Devastating. Complete surrender of the isolated autonomy he'd maintained since becoming Duke of Ravenshollow. Serafina's expression softened with something that looked like relief mixed with determination. Starting now, we rebuild Ravenshollow into something sustainable. Not softer, different. Fear remains tool but not foundation. Loyalty becomes genuine rather than coerced. Power serves stability instead of ego. That's decades of work, and then we'd better start immediately. Lucy Yen pulled her close, recognizing that he'd just committed to transformation that might destroy him more completely than any betrayal. But isolation had nearly killed him tonight. Trust had been murdered. Brutality had preserved immediate survival at cost of long-term sustainability. Evolution was the only remaining option, even if evolution meant becoming something he no longer recognized in ancestral portraits watching from the walls. Outside, dawn broke across Raven's Hollow, while 43 bodies cooled in unmarked graves, and the Duke of Raven's Hollow chose partnership over isolation for the first time in his brutal life. The decision would either save his empire or complete its destruction, but remaining unchanged guaranteed the latter. So he chose the terrifying possibility of the former and called it strategy instead of faith. 3 weeks passed in deceptive calm while the Crown's investigation circled Raven's Hollow like wolves testing defenses. Royal auditors arrived demanding records. Ministers sent formal inquiries about Lord Wren's disappearance. Soldiers in crown colors appeared at border checkpoints, asking uncomfortable questions about the 43 people who'd vanished without explanation. Lucien met every probe with documentation so meticulously fabricated it could survive forensic scrutiny. Financial records proved Wren's embezzlement. Witness testimony placed Cassian in suspicious locations before his disappearance. Evidence suggested both men had conspired together before fleeing separately to avoid prosecution. The lies were comprehensive, professional. Everything Lucien had spent 15 years perfecting. But underneath the surface calm, pressure built like water against cracking dam. Serafina spent 18-hour days managing intelligence networks while simultaneously restructuring Raven's Hollow's governance. Fear-based control was gradually replaced with incentive structures that rewarded competence. Servants who'd once trembled now worked efficiently without constant threat. Nobles who'd cooperated from terror began cooperating from recognition that stability benefited everyone. The transformation was slow, painful, requiring both of them to consciously override instincts trained through decades of brutal pragmatism. Late one night, exhausted beyond rational thought, Lucien found Serafina asleep over reports in the strategy room. He covered her with his coat and stood watching her breathe while something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not possession, not strategic calculation, something that felt dangerously close to contentment. That terrified him more than any assassination attempt, because contentment meant vulnerability, meant having something precious enough that losing it would destroy him more completely than physical death. Every tyrant who'd fallen in history had made the same mistake, allowing themselves to care about something more than survival. Yet here he stood, watching a woman sleep and recognizing that she'd become more essential than the empire itself. The realization should have prompted immediate correction. Distance. Reassertion of isolated control. Everything his training demanded. Instead, he found himself sitting beside her, touching her hair gently and making peace with the fact that he'd fundamentally changed into someone his younger self wouldn't recognize. The Crown's hammer fell on a Tuesday morning when royal soldiers surrounded Raven's Hollow Keep with orders to arrest Duke Lucien Vale and Lady Serafina Arden for conspiracy, murder, and crimes against the realm. Captain Thorne burst into the strategy room where both were reviewing trade agreements. "My lord, Royal Regiment, 500 soldiers, they're demanding your immediate surrender." Lucien stood slowly. "On what grounds?" "Tos." New evidence. Someone provided documentation of the assassinations. Names, dates, methods. Complete intelligence on every operation conducted over the past month. The bottom dropped out of carefully maintained control. "That's impossible. We eliminated everyone with knowledge." Apparently not everyone. Thorne's expression was grim. Someone survived. Someone with detailed information is providing testimony to Crown investigators right now. Serafina's face went pale. "Who?" "They won't say, but the evidence is comprehensive enough that the Crown issued arrest warrants for both of you. Execution is probable if you're taken into custody." Lucien's mind raced through implications with mechanical precision. Someone had survived their purge. Someone patient enough to wait 3 weeks before revealing themselves. Someone with detailed knowledge of operations only Inner Circle would possess, which meant the betrayal went deeper than Cassian. "Defensive positions," Lucien ordered. "Full garrison mobilization. We hold the keep until I understand what we're facing." "My lord, That's open rebellion against the crown. That's survival. Move. Thorn departed at sprint while Lucy turned to Serafina. This was planned. Someone let us think we'd won, waited for our guard to drop, then struck with evidence we thought we'd destroyed. But who? We eliminated everyone connected to Cassian's documentation. Everyone we knew about. Lucian moved to the maps covering the eastern wall, which means Cassian had contingencies we didn't identify. Someone he trusted with backup evidence in case his primary plan failed. Family? All accounted for. Dead or detained. Then who? Serafina's voice carried edge of desperation. Who did we miss? The answer arrived 30 minutes later when Royal Messenger delivered formal ultimatum under flag of truce. Surrender immediately or face siege. The Crown had overwhelming force and evidence sufficient to execute every person inside Raven's Hollow Keep. But attached to the ultimatum was a personal letter. Lucien opened it with cold certainty about what he'd find. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, familiar from hundreds of strategy documents. Lady Serafina Arden's own hand. He read in absolute silence while the world rearranged itself into new terrible pattern. The letter detailed everything. Dates she'd documented operations, methods she'd used to copy evidence, arrangements she'd made with Crown investigators weeks before Cassian's betrayal, contingency plans in case Lucien discovered her true purpose, complete strategic analysis of how to destroy him from within, written in the precise analytical style he'd come to trust absolutely. Lucien looked up slowly. Serafina stood across the strategy table watching him with expression he couldn't quite read. You. His voice was dead calm. From the beginning. She didn't deny it. From the moment I walked into your study requesting my family's estates. Everything was manipulation. Everything was strategy. Exactly what you would have done in my position. Serafina's voice remained steady despite visible tension. My father died because of your policies. My family lost everything because you absorbed our territories. I came here planning your destruction by making me trust you. By becoming indispensable, then documenting every crime, every questionable decision, every line you crossed while I stood beside you pretending partnership. She moved closer. Cassian's betrayal was convenient, accelerated my timeline, but I'd already provided the Crown with everything they needed months earlier. The magnitude of deception was breathtaking. Months of intimacy, strategic partnership, transformation he'd believed was genuine evolution. All of it performance orchestrated by someone who'd studied him well enough to exploit his only weakness. The desire for connection he'd spent lifetime denying. The night we killed 43 people, you suggested that strategy. I created opportunity for you to commit atrocities so comprehensive the Crown couldn't ignore them. You think I manipulated you into mass murder? Serafina's smile was cold. No, I simply provided circumstances where your true nature would reveal itself through choices you made freely, and then documented everything. Meticulously, every death, every order, every moment you proved Cassian right about what you'd become. She pulled documents from inside her coat. The Crown has copies of all of this. Your arrest is inevitable. Surrender now, and maybe you survive trial. Fight, and you guarantee execution. Lucien studied the woman he'd believed was partner and saw only perfect predator. Someone who'd identified his vulnerabilities and exploited them with precision that matched his own brutal methodology. He should have been enraged, should have ordered immediate execution, should have done anything except what he actually felt, which was devastating admiration. You played this perfectly. I learned from the best. Serafina's voice softened slightly. You taught me how power actually works, how to identify weakness and exploit it ruthlessly, how to make people trust you while preparing their destruction. Everything I did, I learned by watching you operate for months. So this is revenge. This is justice. You've crushed dozens of families like mine, absorbed territories, eliminated anyone who opposed you. Someone had to stop you before Raven's Hollow consumed the entire region. She stepped closer. I'm sorry it had to be me. Sorry that parts of this became real when they were supposed to remain tactical. But my purpose never changed. Parts became real. Lucien's voice was dangerous quiet. Which parts? Serafina hesitated. Does it matter? Yes. Because if everything was performance, you're the most talented liar I've ever encountered. But if some of it was genuine, you destroyed something real to achieve revenge. I need to know which. Why? So you can feel better about being manipulated? So I know whether killing you will feel like eliminating a threat or destroying the only person I've trusted in 15 years. The statement hung between them in sudden silence. Serafina's expression cycled through calculation, then something that looked like genuine pain. The strategy was always manipulation, but somewhere between midnight planning sessions and watching you try to evolve into something better than your history, parts of it stopped being performance. Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't plan to care about you. Didn't plan to want the version of Ravenshollow we were building together. But it happened anyway, and now I have to live with the fact that I destroyed it. Why not walk away? You had evidence months ago, could have delivered it to the crown and disappeared. Because I needed to be certain. Needed to see if you were capable of genuine change or if Cassian was right that you're fundamentally broken. She met his gaze directly. And you almost convinced me. Almost made me believe evolution was possible. But then you ordered 43 murders without hesitation and proved that underneath everything, you're exactly the monster your reputation suggests. Murders you manipulated me into committing. Murders you chose freely when cornered. I created circumstances. You provided the brutality. Serafina's voice hardened. Don't pretend I made you into something you weren't already. The accusation landed with devastating accuracy. Because she was right. The mass assassination had been his decision, his strategy, his willingness to eliminate anyone threatening his position. Serafina had created opportunity, but he'd pulled every trigger. Captain Thorne returned with urgent update. My lord, royal forces are positioning siege equipment. They're giving us 1 hour to surrender before bombardment begins. Lucien studied the maps showing Ravenshallow's defenses. Lucien studied the 500 crown soldiers against his garrison of 150. Siege weapons against medieval fortifications designed for different era of warfare. Supplies sufficient for 3 months at most. Militarily, the situation was unwinnable, but surrender meant execution, meant validating every accusation Serafina had documented, meant dying as the tyrant rather than the man he'd been attempting to become. Full defensive mobilization. We hold the keep. My lord, that's suicide. That's the only choice remaining. Lucien turned to Serafina. You wanted justice. Congratulations. You forced me into a corner where the only exit is through violence that will prove every claim you've made. Then surrender, face trial, take responsibility for what you've done. And give you the satisfaction of watching me hang? No. If Ravenshollow falls, it falls fighting. At least that death has meaning beyond validating your revenge. Serafina's expression twisted with something between frustration and genuine anguish. This doesn't have to end in massacre. Yes, it does, because you ensured no other ending was possible. Lucien gestured to guards. Take her to the dungeons. She doesn't get to witness what she's created. Wait! Guards seized her arms before she could continue. She didn't fight, just looked at Lucien with expression that suggested she'd expected exactly this outcome. I really did care about you, she said quietly as they dragged her toward the door. That's not manipulation. That's the tragedy of this entire situation. Tragedy implies unfortunate accident. This was deliberate choice. You chose revenge over partnership. Now we both live with consequences. She was gone before he could say anything else. She, leaving Lucien alone in the strategy room with maps showing impossible defensive situation and the recognition that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd taught to think exactly like him. The irony was devastating. He'd spent 15 years building empire through ruthless pragmatism, had eliminated sentiment, had trusted no one, had maintained perfect isolated control. Then Serafina Arden had walked into his study and systematically dismantled every defense by making him believe connection was possible. And he'd fallen for it completely. The first bombardment began 40 minutes later. Cannonballs crashed into Ravenshollow's outer walls with impacts that shook the entire keep. Stone that had stood for 4 centuries cracked under modern artillery. Defensive positions designed for sword and arrow proved useless against explosives. Lucien directed defense from the battlements while chaos erupted around him. His garrison fought with desperate efficiency, but numbers and technology favored the crown overwhelmingly. By nightfall, the outer walls had collapsed in 3 places. Royal soldiers poured through breaches while Ravenshollow's defenders fell back to secondary positions. Blood spread across ancient stone. Smoke climbed toward dark sky. The keep was dying. Lucien fought alongside his men with savage focus. Every crown soldier who fell bought seconds. Every defensive position held bought minutes. But the math was inevitable. By dawn, royal forces would control the keep, and everyone inside would face execution. Near midnight, Captain Thorne found him in the ruins of the eastern tower. "My lord, we can't hold past sunrise. You need to escape while routes remain open." "Escape to where?" "The crown controls every territory within 3 days' ride. I'd last a week before capture." "Then at least you'd have a week." Thorne's expression was grim. "Dying here proves nothing except you're stubborn. Dying here proves I don't surrender what's mine." Lucien gestured to the burning keep around them. "Ravenshollow was built by my ancestors, maintained through my brutality. If it falls, I fall with it." That's pride talking. That's all I have left. Pride in the certainty that Serafina Arden won't get clean victory. She wanted me destroyed. Fine. But I'll make the destruction so costly, she spends the rest of her life questioning whether revenge was worth the price. Thorne started to respond, but explosion cut him off. The northern tower collapsed with ground-shaking impact. Stones that had stood for centuries tumbled into rubble while screams echoed through smoke-filled air. When the dust cleared, Thorne was dead, crushed beneath falling masonry, another casualty in defensive empire built on brutality. Lucien stood alone in the ruins while battle raged around him. Physically exhausted, emotionally shattered, strategically defeated, but not yet broken. He made his way through collapsing corridors to the dungeons where Serafina was imprisoned. Guards had fled. Cells stood open. But she remained, sitting calmly in the cell as though waiting. "Come to execute me personally?" "Come to offer choice." Lucien unlocked the cell. "The keep is falling. Royal forces will control everything by dawn. You can leave now. Escape through the tunnels. Disappear before your victory becomes complicated by actually witnessing the massacre." "Why would you help me escape?" "Because despite everything, you were right about one thing. I am capable of evolution. Just took complete destruction to prove it." He stepped aside from the cell entrance. "Go, while you can. I won't chase you." Serafina studied him with expression that cycled through suspicion, understanding, then something that looked dangerously like regret. "If I leave, you die here alone." "I die here regardless. Question is whether you want that death on your conscience or in your nightmares." Lucien turned away. "Make your choice quickly. The tunnels won't stay clear much longer." He started walking back toward the battle before she could respond. Behind him, he heard her cell door creak open. Footsteps moving into the corridor, then stopping. "Lucien." He paused but didn't turn around. "I really did care about you. That wasn't strategy. That was the part I didn't plan for and couldn't control. Doesn't change what happens next." "No, but I needed you to know." "Noted. Now leave before I regret offering you escape." The footsteps retreated down the corridor toward the tunnels, fading into darkness while explosions continued shaking the keep's foundations. Lucien returned to the battlements where his remaining garrison held desperate final positions. Maybe 30 soldiers left, all exhausted, most wounded, none with illusions about surviving until dawn. But they held anyway. Because retreat meant execution, and fighting meant dying on their feet. Lucien took position beside them as royal forces prepared final assault. This was how empires ended, not through negotiation or peaceful transition, but through brutal mathematics where overwhelming force eventually ground down even the most stubborn resistance. He'd built Ravenshollow through calculated violence, maintained it through fear, defended it through mass murder. Now it would fall the same way it had risen, in blood and fire, and the recognition that absolute power was always temporary. The final assault began as false dawn lightened the eastern sky. Crowned soldiers flooded through collapsed walls by the hundreds. Raven's Hollow's defenders fought with suicidal courage, but numbers overwhelmed everything. Positions fell one after another. The Great Hall burned. The strategy room collapsed. Lucian fought like a man with nothing left to lose because that's exactly what he was. Every crowned soldier who fell was minor victory and defeat, already guaranteed. Every second held was defiance against inevitable. But inevitability was patient. By the time real dawn broke across the mountains, royal forces controlled everything except the highest tower where Lucian made final stand with 6 remaining soldiers. Below them, the keep burned. Smoke climbed toward gray morning sky. Bodies littered ancient courtyards where his ancestors had ruled for 4 centuries. The crown's commander called up from below. Duke Vale, surrender now and you'll receive trial. Continue fighting and we execute everyone inside when we take that tower. Lucian looked at the 6 soldiers standing beside him. Young men who'd followed orders that led to this moment, who deserved better than death defending tyrants' pride. Go, he told them quietly. Surrender. This isn't your fight anymore. My lord, that's an order. Final order from Duke of Ravenshollow. Go down. Surrender. Love. They hesitated, but ultimately obeyed, filing down the tower stairs with hands raised while Lucien remained alone at the top. One man, one sword, one burning empire. The crown commander called up again. Duke Vale, final warning. Surrender or we're coming up. Lucian looked across the ruins of everything he'd built. 15 years of brutal consolidation, strategic brilliance, ruthless efficiency, all of it reduced to smoking rubble by women who'd loved him enough to destroy him completely. The tragedy was that he understood her reasoning perfectly, would have done exactly the same in her position, had done exactly the same to dozens of other families throughout his reign. This was simply his turn to be crushed by the machinery he'd perfected. Crowned soldiers began climbing the tower stairs. Lucien raised his sword and prepared to sell his last moments as expensively as possible. Then gunfire erupted from unexpected direction. Not from royal soldiers advancing up the stairs, from outside the keep, from the forest beyond collapsed walls. Hundreds of rifles firing simultaneously into crown positions. Chaos exploded across the battlefield as organized ambush tore into royal regiment from completely unexpected vector. Soldiers fell screaming. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The disciplined assault dissolved into confused defensive scramble. Lucien watched in stunned disbelief as mystery forces systematically destroyed siege positions and forced royal soldiers into retreat. Within minutes, the crown's regiment was falling back toward their original positions. Within an hour, they'd fully withdrawn from the keep, leaving Ravenshollow still standing, damaged but defendable. And walking through the smoke and ruins toward Lucien's tower came Seraphina Arden leading armed force that shouldn't exist. She climbed to where he stood watching with expression that mixed exhaustion and grim determination. Surprised? Extremely. I thought you escaped. I did, to mobilize the contingency you didn't know I'd prepared. She gestured to the soldiers securing perimeter. Remember all those minor nobles you absorbed over the years? The families you crushed? The territories you conquered? I've been secretly organizing them for months, promised them restored independence if they helped destroy Ravenshollow. Then why did they just save it? Seraphina met his gaze directly. Because I changed the deal. Convinced them that reforming Ravenshollow was better than destroying it. That the version we were building together was worth preserving even if it meant abandoning revenge. You're saying you chose partnership over completing your revenge. Satish, Maz. I'm saying I got everything to the edge of total victory and realized the cost was too high. Not just your death, but destruction of something that could have become better than either of us alone. Her voice cracked slightly. So I made a choice. The stupidest, most illogical, strategically terrible choice possible. I chose you over revenge. The admission hung in morning air while smoke continued climbing from burning keep. Lucian studied her with assessment that had kept him alive through 15 years of political warfare, looking for deception, finding only exhausted honesty and the recognition that she'd just sacrificed everything she'd worked toward. The crown won't accept this. They'll return with larger force. I know, which means we have maybe 3 days to either fortify enough to survive or negotiate terms they can't refuse. Seraphina stepped closer. And we're doing it together, Ina stepped. Real partnership this time. No manipulation, no hidden documentation, just two people building something better from the ashes of what we destroyed. That's insane, that's completely. But isolation nearly killed you. My revenge nearly destroyed everything. Maybe insanity is the only rational choice remaining. Lucien looked across the ruined keep, at the allied forces Serafina had mobilized, at the impossible situation they now faced together. Every strategic calculation suggested this was temporary reprieve before inevitable destruction, that the crown would return with overwhelming force, that their chances of survival were minimal. But isolation had failed, brutality had failed, manipulation had failed. Perhaps partnership, genuine partnership without deception, was the only strategy left untried. 3 days to prepare for war or negotiate peace. 3 days to prove evolution is possible even for monsters who've forgotten how to be anything else. Serafina took his hand. Can you do it? Lucien studied their joined hands, blood-stained, exhausted, holding on to each other while empire burned around them. I don't know, but I'm willing to find out. Around them, Allied forces began securing positions while dawn broke fully across the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, Crown forces regrouped for inevitable second assault. And standing together in the ruins of everything they'd built and destroyed, the Duke and the woman who'd both saved and damned him prepared for final battle that would determine whether partnership could survive the brutal mathematics of power. The 3 days that followed felt like living inside a held breath. Serafina's allied forces fortified what remained of Raven's Hollow's defenses, while scouts reported Crown movements in the valley below. The Royal Regiment had withdrawn, but not disbanded. They were regrouping, waiting for reinforcements, preparing for assault that would finish what the first attack had started. Lucien spent those 72 hours in the ruins of his strategy room, reviewing every possible outcome with the cold assessment that had kept him alive through 15 years of political warfare. The mathematics remained brutal. Even with Serafina's reinforcements, they were outnumbered 3-1. The keep's defenses were shattered. Supplies would last weeks at most under siege conditions. Militarily, the situation was still unwinnable, but something had shifted in the fundamental calculation. Before, survival had meant maintaining absolute control through fear and isolation. Now survival meant something more complex: partnership, mutual dependence. The recognition that power built solely on brutality eventually collapsed under its own weight. The question was whether that recognition had arrived too late to matter. On the second night, Serafina found him standing in what remained of the great hall where ancestral portraits had burned to ash. She carried wine and exhaustion in equal measure. The scouts report Crown reinforcements arriving tomorrow. Another 300 soldiers. Artillery we can't match. Lucien accepted the wine without looking away from the charred walls. Then we have until dawn to decide whether we fight or negotiate. You're actually considering negotiation. What? I'm considering that dying for pride serves no purpose except proving I learned nothing from the past month. He turned to face her. You destroyed me, rebuilt me, saved me, all while I was too focused on control to recognize what was happening. That's not strategy anymore. That's something else entirely. What would you call it? Evolution, the kind Cassian believed was impossible, the kind that requires admitting everything I built was fundamentally unsustainable. Lucien moved closer. You were right about all of it. The brutality, the isolation, the inevitable collapse. I just needed to lose everything before I could see it clearly. Serafina's expression cycled through emotions too complex to name. So what happens now? Now we try something I've never attempted. We negotiate from genuine weakness and see if honesty works better than deception. That's not how power works. No, that's not how I thought power worked. But I've spent 3 days watching your allied forces coordinate without terror as motivation. Seeing nobles who should hate each other cooperate toward common goal. Witnessing what partnership actually looks like when it's not built on coercion. He took her hands. Maybe I've been wrong about fundamental assumptions for 15 years. Or maybe you're rationalizing because you're out of options. Maybe both things are true simultaneously. Lucien's smile was tired. But I'd rather try rationalizing partnership than die defending isolation. At least one of those has possibility of future beyond tomorrow. The admission should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd said in years, They spent that night drafting terms for negotiation with the crown, not demands from position of strength. Genuine proposals acknowledging Ravenshallow's crimes while offering structural reforms in exchange for clemency. It was humiliating, unprecedented. Everything the Duke of Ravenshallow had spent his life avoiding, but pride had nearly killed him. Perhaps humility offered path to survival. Dawn arrived wrapped in gray mist while crown forces assembled in the valley. But instead of immediate assault, royal messenger approached under flag of truce carrying unexpected summons. The crown wanted negotiation before final battle. Lucien and Serafina rode out to meet royal representatives in neutral ground between armies. The delegation was led by Minister Rothwick, senior advisor to the crown and man Lucien had bribed repeatedly over the years. Rothwick's expression was carefully neutral as they dismounted. Duke Vale, Lady Arden, the crown has reviewed your proposal. And? Lucien kept his voice steady despite knowing this moment determined whether they survived the day. And the crown recognizes several uncomfortable truths. First, destroying Ravenshallow completely would destabilize the entire northern region. Second, Lady Arden's allied forces represent significant military challenge we'd prefer to avoid. Third, your proposal for structural reform addresses legitimate concerns about governance. Meaning the crown is willing to negotiate terms, but they won't be gentle. Rothwick produced documents. Ravenshallow remains under your control with these conditions. First, all territories absorbed through military force in past 5 years are returned to original ruling families. Second, you submit to crown oversight of military operations for next decade. Third, you marry Lady Arden in official ceremony, legitimizing her position and ensuring she maintains check on your authority. The conditions were harsh but survivable. Loss of territory meant reduced power. Crown oversight meant reduced autonomy. But both preserved core empire and prevented immediate execution. Lucien looked at Serafina. She met his gaze with expression that suggested she'd expected exactly these terms. The marriage condition, that was your addition. I told them you were reformable if properly constrained. They wanted guarantee you wouldn't revert to old patterns. Her voice was quiet. I offered myself as that guarantee. Constrained by marriage to the woman who documented my crimes. Constrained by partnership with someone who understands both your worst tendencies and your capacity for better choices. Serafina stepped closer. The crown wants assurance you'll evolve. I'm that assurance. If you agree. Minister Rothwick cleared his throat. The crown requires answer before noon. Accept these terms or face final assault with zero mercy. Lucien studied the documents outlining his reduced empire. 5 years of territorial expansion erased. Military authority curtailed. Personal autonomy subordinated to partnership with woman who'd betrayed him to save him. Every strategic instinct screamed that accepting meant defeat, validation of weakness, permanent limitation of power he'd spent lifetime accumulating. But those instincts had led directly to 43 murders and Burning Keep, had isolated him so completely that betrayal became inevitable, had transformed him into monster even his closest advisor couldn't tolerate. Perhaps those instincts were exactly what needed to die for anything better to survive. I accept all conditions. Rothwick nodded slowly. Then the crown recognizes continued rule of Duke Lucien Vale over Ravenshallow territories under agreed constraints. Formal ceremony confirming terms will occur in 3 days at the capital. One modification, Serafina interjected. The ceremony occurs here, at Ravenshallow, in the Great Hall we're rebuilding. If the crown wants proof of reform, they can witness it happening in the place that needs reformation most. Rothwick looked uncertain. That's unusual request. That's non-negotiable condition. Lucien's voice carried edge of old authority. We've accepted humiliation, but we're not performing it for entertainment at the capital. Ravenshallow remains sovereign territory, even in reduced form. The ceremony happens here or not at all. The minister studied them both, recognizing this was line they wouldn't cross. Finally, he nodded. 3 days. Here. The crown will send representatives to witness. The agreement was sealed. The The crown's forces withdrew, and Lucian found himself standing in neutral ground between armies, realizing he'd just negotiated his way out of certain death by accepting everything he'd spent lifetime fighting against. Reduction, constraint, partnership enforced through legal binding rather than chosen freely. It should have felt like catastrophic defeat. Instead, it felt like the first breathing room he'd had in 15 years. They returned to Raven's Hollow, where Allied forces celebrated survival with cautious relief. Nobles who'd expected death began discussing futures that extended beyond next sunrise. Soldiers who'd prepared for final stand started rebuilding walls instead of graves. And Lucien stood in the ruins of his empire, recognizing that losing had saved him from winning himself into oblivion. That night, alone with Serafina in his chambers, the reality of what they'd agreed to finally settled. Marriage as political constraint. That's new low, even for us. Serafina poured wine with steady hands despite visible exhaustion. The crown needed guarantee you wouldn't backslide. I provided it. By sacrificing your freedom to my supervision. By recognizing we're more effective together than apart. Even when together means legally bound partnership neither of us planned. She handed him wine. Unless you object, the crown would accept alternative guarantee if you have one. Lucien studied her in candlelight. The woman who'd destroyed him, saved him, forced evolution he'd believed impossible. She'd been enemy, ally, partner, and catalyst for transformation that had nearly killed them both. And somewhere in that chaos, she'd become the only person he trusted with complete honesty. I don't object. I'm simply recognizing the irony. I spent my life avoiding exactly this kind of binding commitment. Now it's the only thing standing between me and execution. You're romanticizing. Serafina sat beside him. This isn't love story with convenient political resolution. This is two people who nearly destroyed each other, discovering that survival requires partnership neither is particularly good at maintaining. Brutally pragmatic assessment. You taught me well. She touched his face gently. But pragmatism doesn't exclude genuine feeling. I meant what I said before. Parts of this stopped being strategy. Parts became real despite my better judgment. Which parts? The parts where I watched you try to change. Where I saw someone capable of growth despite history suggesting otherwise. Where I started wanting the version of you that could exist instead of destroying the version that did exist. Her voice softened. Those parts weren't manipulation. They were hope. Dangerous. Illogical hope that people can become better than their worst moments. Lucien pulled her closer, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, recognizing that they'd arrived at this moment through path neither had planned or controlled. Hope is a terrible foundation for empire. Good thing we're not building empire anymore, just trying to maintain functional territory without murdering everyone who disagrees with us. Significantly lower ambition. Significantly more sustainable. They sat in silence while candlelight flickered across walls that had witnessed 15 years of brutal rule. Outside, Allied forces maintained watch. In the valley, Crown representatives prepared to witness ceremony that would formalize everything Lucien had lost and gained simultaneously. 3 days remained until official binding. 3 days to prepare for future that looked nothing like the past either had imagined. The reconstruction of Raven's Hollow's Great Hall became symbol of larger transformation. Nobles who'd once obeyed from fear now contributed labor voluntarily. Servants who'd trembled at Lucien's approach worked alongside him clearing rubble. Serafina's allied forces integrated with Raven's Hollow's garrison through cooperation rather than conquered submission. It was slow, inefficient compared to fear-based motivation, but it built something different than what had existed before. Something that didn't require constant threatening to maintain. On the second day, while overseeing wall repairs, Lucien found himself working beside Lord Pemberton, one of the nobles whose territory he'd absorbed 5 years earlier and who'd nearly died in the siege. They worked in uncomfortable silence before Pemberton spoke. "My lord, I need to ask, why rebuild? You've lost most of your empire. The crown has you constrained. You could negotiate exile and start over somewhere without all this baggage." Lucien set down the stone he'd been moving and considered the question carefully. A month ago, the answer would have been pride. Refusal to surrender what was his. Brutal determination to maintain control regardless of cost. Now the answer felt more complex. Because exile means abandoning everyone who stayed, the servants who didn't flee, the soldiers who held positions when retreat was smarter, the nobles like you who are rebuilding despite having every reason to want me destroyed. He met Pemberton's gaze directly. I built this empire through fear and extraction. Maybe I can rebuild it through something resembling actual responsibility. That's not like you, Chet. No, that's exactly my point. The version of me that would have answered differently is what needed to die for any of this to work. Pemberton studied him with expression that mixed skepticism and cautious possibility. And Lady Arden? She really tamed you? She destroyed me and forced me to rebuild differently. That's not taming, that's surgery without anesthetic. Lucian returned to moving stone, but somehow we both survived the operation. The work continued, stone by stone, hour by hour, rebuilding structure that represented both past brutality and potential future. By the third day, the Great Hall was functional, if not beautiful. Enough space for ceremony, enough dignity to host crown representatives without complete embarrassment, enough symbolic weight to matter. The Crown's delegation arrived at noon, led by Minister Rothwick and Archbishop Meredith, who would officiate the ceremony binding Lucian, Ushan, and Seraphina legally. Behind them came witnesses representing every major noble house. They wanted to see with their own eyes whether the Duke of Ravenshollow would actually submit to constraints. The ceremony began at sunset with all the formal weight of legal transformation. Lucien stood in the great hall his ancestors had built, wearing formal attire that felt like costume after weeks of combat and reconstruction. Seraphina stood beside him in silver that caught dying light through burned windows. Archbishop Meredith spoke the traditional words about unity and partnership, but everyone present understood the real meaning. This wasn't celebration of love. This was political binding designed to constrain dangerous man through partnership with someone capable of checking his worst tendencies. It was humiliating, practical, and somehow appropriate for two people who'd reached this moment through mutual destruction and reluctant salvation. When the Archbishop asked for vows, Lucian spoke words he'd spent 3 days preparing. I vow to rule with temperance rather than terror, to build through cooperation rather than coercion, to remember that power serves purpose beyond self-preservation, and to trust the woman beside me to correct me when I forget these commitments. The hall went silent. No one had expected vulnerability from the Duke of Ravenshollow. Seraphina's vows followed with equal weight. I vow to provide honest counsel even when uncomfortable, to constrain brutality while preserving necessary strength, to remember that reform requires patience beyond revenge, and to trust the man beside me to choose evolution over regression when tested. The ceremony concluded with formal binding recognized by Crown and witnessed by assembled nobles. Lucien and Seraphina were now legally partnered with authority divided and mutual oversight enforced through royal decree. It was everything Lucien had spent his life avoiding, and somehow standing beside the woman who'd destroyed and saved him while ruins of his empire burned around them. It felt like the most honest thing he'd done in 15 years. The feast afterward was subdued. Nobles who'd expected triumph or tragedy instead witnessed uncomfortable middle ground. The Duke of Ravenshollow bound by partnership. The woman who documented his crimes now responsible for his reformation. An empire reduced but surviving through compromise rather than conquest. No one was entirely satisfied, which suggested the arrangement might actually be sustainable. Late that night, after crown representatives had departed and nobles had retreated to quarters, Lucian stood on the rebuilt battlements looking across territory that was simultaneously his and no longer entirely his. Seraphina joined him carrying exhaustion and something that might have been cautious optimism. We survived. But we negotiated survival, not the same thing. Lucian gestured to the reduced borders marked by torchlight in the distance. 5 years of expansion erased, military authority curtailed, personal autonomy constrained by partnership I'm legally bound to maintain. And you're still breathing, still ruling Ravenshollow, still capable of building something better than what existed before. She took his hand. That's not defeat. That's transformation purchased at brutal price. You make it sound noble. This was survival through surrender. No. This was recognizing that your version of victory was unsustainable, that building empire through fear eventually creates enemies patient enough to wait for weakness. Serafina turned to face him directly. Cassian tried to stop you through betrayal. I tried to stop you through documentation. The Crown tried to stop you through overwhelming force. And you're still here because you finally chose evolution over defending past patterns. Evolution forced by circumstances beyond my control. Bu or pam? Marska. All evolution is forced by circumstances. That's how it works. Environment changes. Adapt or die. You adapted. She stepped closer. That takes strength different from brutality, but no less real. Lucien studied her in torchlight. The woman who'd seen through his defenses, who'd documented his crimes, who'd saved him from consequences he'd earned, who now stood legally bound to constrain the worst parts of his nature. I don't know how to be what this requires. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together, make mistakes, correct them, build something imperfect but genuine. Her voice softened. That's what partnership actually means, not perfect harmony. Mutual stumbling towards something better than either could achieve alone. Terrible foundation for governance. Better than isolation and terror. Those were already failing. She was right. He'd known it on some level for years, but had been too proud or frightened to acknowledge the truth. Absolute control was illusion. Fear-based loyalty was temporary. Isolation was slow death disguised as strength. Serafina had forced him to confront those truths by destroying the empire built on their denial. And somehow in the ruins, possibility emerged for building something different. Not softer, the scars were too deep for that, but potentially more durable, power balanced by accountability, authority constrained by partnership, strength tempered by recognition of limitation. It would be difficult, uncomfortable, requiring constant vigilance against old patterns, but the alternative was returning to isolation that had nearly killed him. I'm trusting you with everything, Dietz. Serafina smiled slightly. I know. That terrifies both of us, but trust is the only currency we have left after burning everything else. They stood together on the battlements while night deepened across Raven's Hollow's reduced territories. Below them, reconstruction continued by torchlight. Walls being rebuilt, wounds being tended, empire being reshaped into something that might survive beyond next crisis. The following weeks settled into new rhythm neither had experienced before. Lucien governed with Serafina's counsel integrated into every major decision. Not because the crown required it, but because he'd discovered her analysis prevented mistakes his pride would have ignored. Nobles who'd feared him began approaching with legitimate concerns rather than terrified obedience. Territories returned to original families reorganized themselves with surprising efficiency once extraction ended. Raven's Hollow was changing, not quickly, not completely, but visibly enough that even skeptical observers recognized the transformation was genuine. 1 month after the ceremony, Lord Ashford requested private audience. Lucien received him in the rebuilt strategy room with Serafina present. Ashford looked nervous but determined. My lord, I need to confess something. I was considering joining Ren's coalition. Before everything collapsed, I was prepared to betray you. The admission should have prompted rage. Instead, Lucien felt something closer to weary understanding. Why confess now? Because the man who would have executed me for considering betrayal is gone, and the man who remains might actually hear why betrayal seemed necessary. Ashford met his gaze directly. You ruled through terror, made everyone calculate whether survival required eventually opposing you. I chose my family over loyalty because loyalty felt like waiting for inevitable execution. And now this. Now I'm watching you actually try to change, seeing governance that doesn't require constant fear, wondering if partnership with Raven's Hollow might work better than plotting against it. Ashford's voice steadied. I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm asking whether the new model has room for nobles who considered betrayal but chose differently. Lucien studied the man who'd just confessed to planned treason. A month ago, the response would have been immediate execution. Today, the calculation was more complex. The new model assumes everyone has breaking point. The goal isn't preventing breaking, it's making cooperation more attractive than betrayal. He leaned forward. So yes, there's room. But understand that trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. You're starting from deficit. Understood, my lord. You will embrace. After Ashford departed, Seraphina spoke quietly. You just forgave planned treason. I acknowledged reality. Terror creates resentment. Resentment creates betrayal. The cycle continues until something breaks. Lucien moved to the window. If I execute everyone who considered opposing me, I'd have to execute half the nobility. Better to transform the system that made opposition seem necessary. That's remarkably evolved thinking from man who ordered 43 assassinations 6 weeks ago. That's recognizing I was dying faster through brutality than I am through compromise. He turned back. The version of me that would have executed Ashford destroyed himself through isolation. This version might actually survive long enough to matter. Might. Best either of us can offer given circumstances. The months that followed proved the fragility of transformation built on ruins. There were setbacks. Moments when old patterns resurfaced and Lucian's first instinct was overwhelming force. Times when nobles tested whether reformation was genuine or performance. Incidents where Seraphina's restraint felt like weakness rather than wisdom. But they persisted, learning together what partnership actually required, making mistakes, correcting them, building trust through consistent choices rather than dramatic gestures. Slowly, Raven's Hollow stabilized, not back to previous power, but into something more sustainable. Territory reduced but governed competently. Military capability constrained but professionally maintained. Authority balanced between Duke and Duchess with oversight preventing regression. It wasn't the empire Lucian had imagined building, but it was empire that might outlive him instead of collapsing the moment his grip weakened. On the anniversary of the siege, Lucien stood in the Great Hall before a gathering of nobles, soldiers, and common citizens who'd participated in reconstruction. He'd prepared speech outlining achievements and future goals, standard ceremony acknowledging progress. But looking across faces of people who'd survived his brutality and chosen to remain, different words emerged. A year ago, Raven's Hollow burned. Not just walls and buildings. Everything the previous Duke had built through 15 years of calculated terror. That man believed absolute control was strength. That isolation was protection. That fear was sufficient foundation for empire. The hall was silent. Every person present knew this history intimately. That man was wrong. And his wrongness nearly destroyed everyone in this hall. Some of you fought against him, some fought for him. Some simply tried to survive, while power consumed everything around you. But you're all here now because after burning came choice. Rebuild differently or abandon ruins entirely. Lucian's voice carried weight of genuine transformation rather than political theater. We chose rebuilding, not back to what was, forward into something untested, partnership instead of domination, cooperation instead of coercion. Trust earned instead of obedience extracted. It's been difficult, uncomfortable, requiring everyone present to function differently than terror trained us. He found Seraphina in the crowd. She nodded slightly. But it's working. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably better than the burning isolation that preceded it. So today we mark not triumph, but survival. Not victory, but persistence. Not the empire that was, but the territory that remains and might actually endure. The applause was cautious but genuine. These weren't people celebrating returned glory. They were acknowledging the hard work of not collapsing entirely. After the ceremony, Seraphina found him on the battlements where they'd stood countless times over the past year. Good speech. Honest without being maudlin. I'm learning. Lucian pulled her close. Slowly, with significant supervision. That's what partnership means. Mutual supervision toward goals neither could reach alone. Still terrible foundation for governance. Still better than what existed before. They stood together watching sunset paint Raven's Hollow's rebuilt walls in gold and crimson. Territory reduced but standing. Empire constrained but functional. Future uncertain but possible. In the valley below, farmers worked fields that would feed population through coming winter. In the keep, soldiers trained to defend rather than conquer. In the council chambers, nobles debated policy through genuine discussion rather than terrified obedience. It wasn't the power Lucian had spent 15 years accumulating. But it was something more valuable. It was sustainable. And standing beside the woman who'd destroyed him to save him while evening light faded across mountains that had witnessed 4 centuries of ducal rule, Lucien recognized that transformation was ongoing rather than complete, that every day required choosing evolution over regression, that partnership was constant work rather than achieved state. But for the first time in his brutal life, the work felt worthwhile rather than exhausting. I still don't know if what we've built will survive us. Serafina leaned against him. Nothing survives forever. Question isn't whether it's permanent. Question is whether it's better than what existed before, and whether future generations might build on it rather than burning it down. And I think we've given them possibility, not certainty. Just possibility that governance can function through cooperation rather than terror. That's more than either of us brought to this a year ago. Lucien considered that carefully. Possibility instead of certainty. Partnership instead of domination. Survival through adaptation rather than overwhelming force. It wasn't the legacy he'd imagined building, but it was legacy that might actually matter beyond his lifetime. I suppose that's sufficient. More than sufficient. It's human, fallible, real. She turned to face him. Everything the Duke of Ravenshollow was too frightened to be until circumstances destroyed every alternative. You make destruction sound like gift. Sometimes it is. Sometimes everything has to burn before anything better can grow. Serafina smiled. We're just fortunate enough to have survived the burning. Night fell across Ravenshollow while they remained on the battlements. No longer isolated tyrant and manipulative destroyer. Just 2 people who'd learned through mutual devastation that strength meant accepting limitation and power meant sharing authority and control meant recognizing when surrender was actually evolution. The empire that remained was smaller, constrained, accountable to partnership neither had wanted but both had discovered was essential for anything to survive. It wasn't the story Lucien had imagined living. Wasn't the triumph he'd spent 15 years pursuing. Wasn't the absolute dominion he'd believed was only measure of success. But standing beside Serafina while stars emerged over mountains that had witnessed their mutual destruction and reluctant salvation, Lucien understood something his ancestors' portraits could never have taught him. That real power wasn't crushing everyone who opposed you. It was building something worth preserving even after you were gone. That true strength wasn't isolation. It was vulnerability chosen deliberately despite knowing the risks. That actual control was recognizing what you couldn't control and partnering with people who complemented rather than submitted. The Duke of Ravenshollow had died in flames and blood, and the ruins of empire built on terror. What remained was simply a man, flawed, trying, stumbling forward with partner who knew his worst moments and chose him anyway. It was smaller life than he'd planned, less glorious, more uncertain, but it was real and human, and possibly sustainable beyond the brutal mathematics that had governed everything before. And in the quiet darkness of Ravenshollow's rebuilt battlements, with the woman who'd saved him by destroying him standing close enough to feel her heartbeat, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered after the burning finally stopped and the rebuilding actually began.